Well, we have a lot of talked about, so we'll have people arrive as they arrive. But we'll go ahead and call this meeting to order, June 30th at 5:02. Nice special meeting of the board, and we're going to talk all about our return to learn plans. A lot of different pieces there for sure, and a pretty big group of people put it all together. So I don't think I can introduce everyone. So I assume everybody that's going to speak can kind of introduce themselves as they go. I don't know if it needs any more introductions, so I'll pass it off to Matt. Either this is your last official duty as an assistant superintendent or first official duty as interim superintendent. You get a pick.
Maybe we'll just call it both, Sean. How about that?
All right, fair enough.
Just go with both. All right. So lucky to have a great team here with me. So good evening, everyone. And thanks for coming together on somewhat short notice here and for gathering for the special meeting. I think a few things. We wanted to try to provide some more current information about where we're at in our return to learn planning process. As you know, the state has asked for submission of some assurances due as of July 1st. We submitted those today and those were approved. But that's only one step. That's a set of assurances about what we'll account for and what we'll plan for in our return to learn planning. Those plans are not complete. They're works in progress as we go through here. And so I think that's been a difficult part to also communicate to the community that the July 1st date got put out there. And I think there was a perception that all of those plans would be done and communicated by that point. But really what was due to the state in our CASA system were those assurances, as we've talked to you guys about several times. We know that last Thursday there was a guidance put out from the Department of Ed that I think underwhelmed many of our stakeholders in regards to its level of detail and even some of the specific recommendations. Today they followed up with a question and answer document that outlines a few more things that schools could do or schools can consider. What I did provide for you on board docs this evening, or the team did, is what was released last Thursday to that effect, that I'm sure many people have waded through and looked at those 9 or 10 items that are on there. For us, I think what we want to assure people and assure you guys is that we move through the month of July here. What we'll continue to do is release more specifics of information kind of week by week. And whether we as a team here decide with the board that we need to have some more regular meetings to go through those specifics, or what that structure looks like as we get into some of this conversation, we can definitely do that. But for us, we think it's important to continue coming with more information as we have it, to start with some of the pieces we have tonight that include some decisions and also some things that we just want people to know we're talking about and considering, even if we don't have final recommendations on those points, because we know there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety, and there's a lot of questions anytime you deal with something as significant as a global pandemic and the health and safety concerns that come through that. So I think our goal for this evening is to introduce, like I said, in some more in-depth fashion, some of the recommendations that we do feel like we're ready to communicate, along with, like I said, some other considerations of things that are actively in our planning process for whichever model we do land on for August 24th, or whichever series of models that we consider that we may have to evolve through this coming school year. The other goal, I think the secondary goal, and maybe the largest one for this evening, is to know what options are still on the table as far as a hybrid conversation. And that will be kind of where we wrap up tonight and try to get some input from you all and feel like we have some direction to move and that we can take some next steps in that regard. So I kind of wanted to make sure that everybody understood what was due tomorrow, that we kind of have done, and that we don't feel like we're necessarily stuck in the decision-making mode this evening, but also impress a little bit of urgency that we do need to be able to cycle out some of the options that maybe are no longer on the table and start to narrow our focus on what models we are still going to pursue, and make sure we can implement plans to be ready to go in that regard. So any questions from the outset before we get started, kind of walking through our slides here for this evening?
Hey, Matt, this is Janet. Can you hear me? We're going to cover sort of health and safety issues as part of this, right? Face coverings and all that.
Yep.
I mean, part of the Department of Ed's guidance that was underwhelming and actually enraging to lots of people. So as long as that's part of the conversation tonight, that's fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. Yep, that's a significant part of what we have. So thanks for that, Janet. Any other questions before we get started? And I think where I direct your attention then is to the PowerPoint we have uploaded onto Board Docs there. And I don't know if we need to do a share screen and walk through it, or if everybody just wants to pull it up on their own. Any preference there?
So Matt,
Yes.
shouldn't we share a screen for the attendees to be able to see it?
Yeah, I just thought of that when I said that. That probably
Okay.
makes sense. Yep. So we'll go ahead and let me get to the right tab here. Is everyone able to see that? Trying to look for some nodding heads. Sean,
Yep.
can you give me a good
I can
nod?
see it.
You're on my
Yep.
screen. Okay, great. Okay, so this you can find on our district website. This was the 2-pager that we created that we showed you last week, but we'll also have this PowerPoint uploaded onto the Return to Learn portion of our website. As we continue to update information, you'll see updates there. We've dated this so people can reference when this was presented, and then also when new updates will come so they can track our information share as we move through the month. So this first slide talks about the 7 different areas that we've talked to you about several different times with the leadership, infrastructure, health, safety, academic standards, social, emotional, behavior, health, equity, and data. As far as our considerations as we've tried to plan for this. From a leadership, let me get this moved around here. Leadership perspective, we shared last time with you the team, or the teams, excuse me, that we built and had in motion. And you've heard us kind of sing their praises and their accolades as we went through this about how many people have just stepped up and committed extra time and been part of the solution and part of the conversation as we work through this, and will continue to do so as we move through July here and closer to the start of the school year. So those are kind of repeat pieces of information, but that's really our first component of leadership is we needed to identify a leadership team. We need to look at a continuous improvement process where we meet multiple times a week to review our progress on the model and then talk about how we communicate out that model. And so you heard kind of the big picture communication piece, but you're also going to hear some communication aspects that we need to take into consideration about how we communicate with all of our stakeholder groups as we get closer to the start of the school year. And that's a consideration on the leadership side. So then for the rest of the for the next few slides of the presentation, we're going to turn it over to the leads on each of those areas. And I'll ask Amy and Chase if they have any opening comments before we turn it to the leads, but otherwise we'll work through those different leads and they'll kind of share their up-to-date progress about where they're at and any kind of decision points or critical considerations that we're ready to report out on. So Amy or Chase, if you guys have anything to add from the opening, go ahead, or otherwise we'll have Adam and Nick jump in with infrastructure.
No, Matt, I think you did a great job of summarizing our work to date and the key components for the leadership aspect of it. I just want to send a big shout out to our teams, our leads for what they're able to share tonight. There's been a lot of progress made over the last few weeks, and you can see that in the content that's been developed for this evening.
I would echo that and just, reiterate that this is a starting point, that by no means is it a final plan. And so we'll continue to build on this, but we believe that we do have a good base in place and still though nimble enough to make changes as we go. And echo what Amy said about thanks to the team for all their hard work so far.
Well, I'll go ahead and kick us off then for the infrastructure group, if that's all right, Matt.
Yeah, please do.
So Matt, Adam and I help lead the infrastructure group, and I think we both like to say thank you to the many voices and people who have contributed to some of the things that we'll be sharing with you tonight. And Adam's going to be speaking later on, so I'll take this one for you. Some of these things we've shared earlier. The portion here on the calendar is something that we shared early on. We want to get that information out to families as soon as possible, that the calendar would not change nor the length of the day. So we have that information in here again. Attendance and grading is something that's part of our conversation here. And attendance, we've kind of landed on, some of the guidance that has been provided is that there should be leniency provided to students during this time, of course. And then we wanted to look into even more specifics of not having it set up where students would be dropped from classes automatically due to excessive absences, or attendance should not be a part of the grading process. So those are some pieces that we've recommended through the attendance piece. Professional development occurs in all the different categories. So we are really looking at all the different categories that you're going to hear about tonight in the Return to Learn plan, from social, emotional, behavioral health, as we know that will be hugely important, to equity, to health and safety, all these different categories. But then the infrastructure group really looked at how then could we deliver that professional learning, dependent on the model that we're in. So it may be in person, but at a kind of following socially distanced guidelines. It may be online in an asynchronous way where we're together, or it may be online through some of our trainings or webinars that we need to have in place. So all those things are possibilities. And the next steps in the professional development is just looking at maybe the way we need to do that for our staff, the way we need to do that for even families. There's been some recommendations from some of our committees that you'll hear later on that even families need some, well, how do we do this living in maybe a more online or an at-home learning world? And then we also tackled many of the basic needs. We're not going to get into great detail right now because we're kind of the structures or the supports that assist the groups that will be talking about these more. But as you know, technology, the one-to-one initiative, the internet access for everyone, nutrition. We've worked with Allison and her team and Chase and others that, we want to be committed to providing meals no matter the instructional model. So it'll look different depending on what instructional model we may be at a time, but we want to provide that. Shelter and food fall under here, but that's talking more about what are the resources we can have and the community has to work with homelessness and work with food insecurity for our families. Social, emotional, behavioral health, again, coming back to that and the importance of supporting our students, because we know this will be an emotional time, hopefully returning to school or whatever that may be, staff members facing a variety of challenges themselves, and also families. And then we want to make sure there's equity in what resources and in-district supports are available. And then I won't steal any of the thunder from the health and safety group, but as you know, we've been having conversations as to what makes the best sense for PPE usage, cleaning, shared equipment, sanitizing, and many more things. And then also transportation, working with our transportation team to decide, to think about PPE usage on buses, what capacity can we operate under, and what expectations exist dependent on the kind of what model we're in and how often kids need to be coming to school or what that may be. Adam, is there anything else you'd want to add if I missed something there?
No, other than, I think that in all of these categories, as Nick mentioned, it's really important to keep in mind, especially the health and safety components, social, emotional, behavioral, also the academic standards work, which this just barely touches on. Our focus was really on the structures to support district capacity in those areas. So as we go through the presentation, you'll hear more specifics coming from those areas. So, as we circle back for questions later, just something to keep in mind.
All right, thanks guys. Next area is health and safety. So Kate and Dwayne have been leading that work for us, and I believe Kate is going to walk you through these two slides.
All right, good evening. We have had a robust committee that has been working on health and safety and really learning more about mitigation efforts that we could employ as a school district. And I'll mention some of these to you. The Return to Learn Safety Committee, and I just wanted to make sure that I emphasize it's a different committee than the safety committee in the district. This one is focused on Return to Learn. It's recommending that students and staff wear a face covering, so a face mask or a face shield, while attending school and participating in school activities. Of course, there will always be certain circumstances, such as a medical condition, that could allow for an exception to this requirement. Next recommendation is on hand hygiene and respiratory etiquette. And there's professional development that's offered by the AEA for teachers on hand washing, hygiene, covering a sneeze, and how to teach these practices to students. We want to make sure that we're providing that professional development and training for students and having procedures in place for frequent hand washing, along with posters and reminders in our school communities of this expectation. In addition to that, we want to make sure we provide hand sanitizer when students are unable to use soap and water. As far as classroom configuration, the safety committee is reviewing best practice of social distancing in the classroom setting. We are reviewing instructional space arrangements based on health and safety that can be utilized. So we're looking at how desks are spaced apart, what the seating arrangement could look like, such as making sure all desks are facing the same direction rather than facing each other. And also we're looking at taking those soft furniture items out of classrooms, such as bing bags or other items like that are hard to clean. Looked at meal distribution and changes that may need to take place on site as part of providing services to students. But during that time, as Nick mentioned as well, we'll be sure to have our on-site program as well as grab and go meals for students that are choosing to learn remotely, or if we need to go into a remote learning environment, then providing meals for everyone. We've spent quite a bit of time looking at the building and classroom cleaning and sanitizing procedures. So we're looking really at the processes for daily cleaning for all district sites, trying to better understand when it's necessary to clean items, sanitize or disinfect, which are all very different practices requiring different different materials to be utilized, and then also who's responsible for this work. We know that that would be a lot of work for custodians, but there may be work that can be conducted by others as well. We're looking at bus transportation. So there's guidelines that we're recommending with bus transportation, such as the use of face coverings. And when we looked at the social distancing that the CDC is recommending on buses, recommending that students could social distance with 13 passengers per bus, but if wearing a face mask, that they could transport 28 students per bus. And you can see that that's problematic for us, as we are currently busing far more riders than that daily. And let's see, our learning model transition. So what this involves is the district is developing a process with the guidance from the Department of Public Health for if and when classroom schools or the district must transition between on-site and required continuous learning at home. Part of this is really determining what metrics we are going to be using, but it's not an all or nothing. There's a possibility that we may at times have to close down a classroom or a school if there's a need to quarantine for a period of time, or when do we look at needing to have the entire district close. And the last area is another recommendation from the safety committee on the plexiglass and installing plexiglass guards in the school main offices, cafeterias, serving lines, media area, kind of that checkout area, and any other kind of high density areas where it's difficult for individuals to remain at least 6 feet apart. I think, Dwayne, do you have anything that I missed in that you want to add?
He either doesn't or he's muted. I guess one thing I would add there, Kate, is that we just want to reassure people that we're not going it alone on this effort, that that health and safety team has looked at guidance from obviously the CDC, Iowa Department of Public Health, Johnson County Public Health, American Academy of Pediatrics, the University of Iowa has been a helpful partner, and then of course Johnson County Emergency Management. And so we're really trying to rely on their guidance and some of their advice and counsel to us through those points. And maybe one other piece to highlight is that learning model transition, and knowing that you can think about it like the weather handbook almost, where we've had different metrics about when we've made decisions about school closures for heat or snow, and things in that regard. And we want to be transparent and open about the same thing here, that, you know, when would be those scenarios we'd look at it on a classroom, school, or district level, about when we would need to consider transition points between the different models. So Dwayne, I don't know if you're muted there, if you have anything else to add, or if we want to move to the next portion. He's still being silent. So we'll go ahead and shift to academic standards. And I'd say, of course, board here too, as you kind of when we get through the chunks of these 7, if you have questions, we're certainly happy to go back to that before we dive into the models question.
All right, academic standards. So hello, everyone. Scott Kibbe and I have been working with several teams on the academic standards, and our work really has focused on 3 main projects. This first one that we're going to talk about really applies no matter what model we're in. So whether we're in an online model or on-site or a hybrid model, we know, our teachers know, that there's some unfinished learning from the spring closure that we're going to need to address when kids come back to school. So we already have teams working together to address that unfinished learning. So we've learned from other districts that have gone through school closures, maybe through like Hurricane Katrina, that the best way to address that unfinished learning is not through a remediation model. So we don't want teachers to come back to school and expect that they're going to spend the first trimester of the year teaching the learning that was lost, maybe the last trimester of last year. With that model, we're just always going to be a trimester behind. So what we've learned is that we really need to accelerate student learning through kind of this just-in-time model. So we've got our teams together. They're looking at what are our priority standards, what are the essential understandings that kids really need to learn next year throughout the year. And those will be very similar to what we've taught in the past. And then we look at each unit that we teach and we consider what might be the lost learning that kids may not have had, or the unfinished learning that kids may not have been exposed to last spring. And we think about how we can deliver that learning just in time. So as the units occur throughout the year, we will do some assessments of students to get a better understanding of their prerequisite knowledge. So we know if they need maybe some mini lessons, or how we can kind of fill in the gaps in their understanding so that they are then ready to proceed right into grade level curriculum that we know we need to get them to as quickly as possible in order to get everybody back on track. So we are really looking at what assessments we need to kind of identify where our student learning needs are at the beginning of the year and then kind of throughout the year, and then how we match our curriculum to those student learning needs, and how we can make sure that we're addressing anything that might be unfinished learning from the past. So the other 2 really things that we're working on the projects, if you want to go to the next slide there, Matt. The other project then is really just focused on if we have to be in a school closure setting. So if at any point in the year we would need to shut down school, how we might be able to offer that remote continuous learning at home in a manner that is different than the way we offered it in the spring. We tried to put things in place quickly in the spring, and our teachers did a fabulous job of really making that transition as quickly as we could, but we know it wasn't as quick as we would have wanted, and not as nimble as maybe we'll need to be in the fall. So we have been working on putting together many things so that if that situation presents itself in the fall, we're going to be ready to do it. So we have schedules that we've created for remote continuous learning or learning at home. That's going to provide daily instruction in all content areas. We're going to have synchronous activities where students would be expected to maybe attend class meetings or class sessions through Zoom. And then we're going to have asynchronous activities. So it might be videos of lessons or some flexible offline or maybe even some online assignments that kids will be able to do at a time that's most convenient for them. We've really looked at the research on how much screen time is appropriate for students at different levels to make sure that we're not asking kids to be on screen all day long. And we're going to make sure that students understand that in the fall or throughout the next year, the participation is going to be required. We stuck in the spring with a voluntary situation in K-8, but we're not going to do that in the fall. So next school year, if we have to go to remote learning, all students will be expected and supported in participating in the instruction. And then certainly make sure that we've got services for all of our students, whether they're, special education or English language learners or talented and gifted. And we're making sure that we're able to provide a full range of supports for our kids. And then we're also really thinking about what teachers need in order to be able to do this well. So we've been working on professional development that's going to be needed for our teachers. We've incorporated in the daily schedule some time for teacher collaboration so they can kind of help each other and support each other through this online instruction. Making sure that they have access to technology, making sure that they'll have access if they need to come into the building to be able to deliver instruction from their classroom. So if you're a chemistry teacher, you can get in your lab and demonstrate. If you're an art teacher, you're going to be able to get to your materials and demonstrate your lessons in your classroom. And then also we're thinking about what kind of supports our families will need. So how can we set up videos or guides or online sessions to help support our parents? So as they're helping to support the children at home, we're going to make sure that they have everything that they need to be able to do that.
One thing, and then I would ask, if Scott has anything he'd want to add in there too, and I think Diane touched on it, but was that universal design for equity. You're going to see that come back a couple different times, once in SCBH, and then of course in the equity part of the presentation too. But and I think the equity team will do a nice job of framing how we've considered equity throughout all parts of the plan, but that has been a special consideration for us around professional development to support teachers around social emotional behavior health curriculum, cultural proficiency expectations, and ways to implement culturally relevant curriculum. So that is something this team has also looked at, but we'll have a larger conversation around equity, of course, in that portion of it. So Scott, anything else you wanted to add on the academic standards portion?
Just a little thing, and that was on the PD side of things. The Grantwood AEA has that field guide, which helps staff teach an online environment, and Adam's working with them to tailor that to Iowa City schools so that some of the stuff that doesn't apply to us will be off, and it'll still support staff. So we'll be rolling that out very soon.
Thanks, Scott. All right, now we'll move on to social emotional behavior health, and that is Jeremy and Laura.
Hi, everybody. I'll give the update tonight, and I'm sure Jeremy will add anything that would enhance what I am sharing. When we think about the social emotional behavioral supports for our students, a lot of that really connects to the PD and the support, the resources and the tools that we want staff to receive so that they're able to provide those supports. So starting with what students in general we've developed on our team is we want to make sure that there's a variety of resources for students in the various learning environments that we could encounter to be able to request support. So some of those traditional ways that students may have, hey, stopped into the school counselor's office or, requested some help or those sorts of things. We want to make sure there's avenues for them, whether it's a virtual format or however it's going to look so that they still feel comfortable kind of seeking out help. So that's one thing. We also want to make sure that the students, that we're tracking students, and so it isn't just putting it on them to request help. And so equity team might give a little bit of an update with a contact log that we are going to be using and have some multiple methods that we're looking at for early warning systems so that we do know which students are participating and which, we may be concerned about their engagement or the connectedness so that we can use the data and all of the tools and information we have to really identify which students are doing okay and which students we may need to make some potential, reaching out to them and their families. So that's part of what we really want to make sure we've got in place. We also want students to feel that sense of connection. We know that, since all of this has occurred, there's, naturally been the effect of feeling, maybe being a little bit isolated. And so what our team has had some good conversations and ideas about how to keep peers connected and, with each other as well as with staff. When we think about the social emotional behavioral health of students, one of the really important aspects of that is integrating social emotional learning into all learning environments. And so even though we absolutely want to have that just-in-time learning and push students forward academically, that's all based upon them feeling safe, secure, and connected. We know so many students, because of the pandemic, as well as because of the issues that are happening in our world now with race and inequity, we need to focus more, even more so now, on creating those safe learning environments. And so we will capitalize on providing some professional development for all staff related to trauma-informed practices, and all the way from understanding the impact of trauma upon yourself, that compassion fatigue when you are caring for others, as well as actual practices that can be implemented in learning environments to make it safe for students. So kind of moving on to that varying levels of professional development, we will need to provide some ongoing series of PD tools and resources to provide our teaching staff and everybody supporting students with the importance of social emotional learning, and then just some, what does it look like, and how can that be implemented into any classroom environment. And also for staff to have their own system of support. We want to make sure that we are setting in a variety of different ways that can be done at a building staff level, whether it's kind of a buddy check-in system with a colleague or a group of colleagues, weekly check-ins, staff restorative circles. So as we look at implementing all of that, then we think about the supports for families so that they also have a variety of ways that they can request help. One of the things that we see as important in this process is really working with our community partners and some resources that are already out there to provide some helpful tips for families and to make sure that our communication to families is succinct and matches the language that they need to be able to receive that communication in. So to continue to think of different various ways that we can provide communication for our diverse family population. And we also want to make sure that, along with some of this is kind of tied to some of the other teams, as you can see, but just their basic needs are taken care of, and that there's a wealth of information, quick information about community resources or avenues that they also can receive support during this time.
And one thing I might just jump in with, Laura, that sparked a thought about something that Chase and I have been working on with the Project Better Together community group is trying to do some pop-up sites for families here even before the school year starts or once the school year is in play, that when we work with families that, they have multiple needs, and some of those are school needs, but some of those are just larger community needs. And so we're trying to be a good partner in that effort to know how we could potentially use some of our sites and some of our internet access to help families deal with some of the multitude of issues they're facing through this pandemic. So that was a side thought. So sorry to interrupt you if you're still going there, Laura, but something I thought was important in the families portion for people to be aware of too.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that. I was kind of coming to an end and curious if Jeremy had anything to add that I maybe didn't share out that we've been focusing on planning on, but absolutely, I think that's very important. And, to make those connections for families and use our existing staff. One of the things I guess I would add that you made me think of, Matt, was that, typically in whatever learning environment we have been used to in the past, every educator in our system may not have had, in-depth knowledge about the various resources and supports for families. And that's not necessarily a realistic expectation for everyone, though our team has talked about the importance of maybe just some basic foundational information so that if you are communicating with a family or a student, if it happens to be in a virtual format, you as that individual educator can say, hey, let me connect you to, our student and family advocate, our counselor, our administrator, or here are some resources that I'm aware of, so that it's provided, in that moment as well. So that kind of made me think, when you're talking about the pop-up sites and things like that, that's another thing that we've talked about, just a quick reference guide for various types of basic resources in the community to be able to share.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. Anything you wanted to add there before we move on?
No, nothing else that I can think of.
All right, thanks, guys. And the next portion here is on equity. And so Laura, Gray, and Lisa, Glenn, you're up.
Yes, so I will be doing most of the sharing tonight just for the sake of time, and then Laura will chime in as she thinks of things or if I'm forgetting anything. So for the equity portion of the plan, we're going to think both in broad and specific terms of equity. Equity can't be an afterthought. It can't be retrofitted. Equity has to be a universal design, meaning that it can't be the last thing we think of. It has to be the very first thing we think of. And how do we build an equitable system from the ground up? How do we plan for an equitable system that allows access for everyone? How do we make sure that students can access our system? How do we make sure that staff are supported? How do we make sure in the planning phase, not as an afterthought, instead? So with our plan, we had to build it the same way also. So that is why, as we've gone through the plan, you've already heard all of the other committees talk a lot about, and as we were walking through this, we were planning for the equity pieces. So we've had members of our equity committee sitting on the other committees, and part of that is to bring the voice of some of our equity conversations to those other committees. And specifically bring our conversations to those conversations, and replicate some of our discussions there. Also, in addition to that larger kind of conversation, we've also had some specific planning to do, and that's specifically with regard to students who are at risk, students with IEPs, students who are English learners, and then students who are talented and gifted. And we know that even when, the planning for equity is fundamental to all the work that we do, we will still have some work above and beyond that, some very specific plans for some additional supports that some students will need. And that's kind of what will go into this equity portion of the plan. So a lot of that, will be one of the things we've already done. And you've already heard a couple of other people talk about this. We needed just something as simple as, it sounds simple, but it hasn't been simple. Agreeing on a uniform format for a contact log. Laura Gray led part of our committee through looking at the data behind who didn't engage as much as we wanted them to. Around our required model last spring, who didn't do well with the supports that we had to offer at that time. That is, I keep saying, that is baseline information. That is as well as we could do at that time under the circumstances we were in then. Now we have different circumstances, and we have an opportunity to do it better, and to do it better and better and better all the time. So we take that baseline information and we improve upon it. So, under those circumstances, who didn't do well, and then what do we need to do so that they can do better? And so we know that now. We know a lot about who didn't do well, and one of the things we suspect is that we didn't reach out to them enough, or consistent enough, or maybe the right people weren't able to reach out to them, or there's something about that contact that we didn't achieve as well as we wanted to. So we needed a contact log. And part of it is the cumbersome nature that we didn't even have a uniform log. So those are the structures from the district level that we needed to set up. So we've established that, and that's one of the things that will go in as part of the plan. So, you know, those are the kind of things that we'll see in this part of the plan. Additionally, we'll have, you know, some other things that are special ed specific, some things that are ELL specific. A lot of our special education items will be protocols for teams to walk through. You know, special education is all about individual planning, but teams have to have some guidance of how to plan. How do we plan individual supports in this environment? And so those processes, that protocol for teams to be able to even know what questions to ask within the team. Those are the things that you'll see. All IEP students will have an IEP meeting to establish a remote learning plan, and we'll set up the district process for being able to get that done. The district will allow parents the choice in regards to how some students will return in the fall. The district will provide more variety to communicate to parents, including shorter bulleted communication, more accurate translations. You know, so there are some differences that we will, in choice, that we will offer to parents and students within the special populations that have been designated for this part of the plan. So what have I forgotten, Laura? I'm sure there are some things.
I think you covered it. The only one thing I would say is in regards to access to learning, and trying to figure out why some students access learning and some did not. We talked about best practices in regards to cultural proficient teaching and learning. And so that was one of the professional development pieces that we wanted to put in place for our staff. But you covered everything else.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So there's another example of that. You know, there are some broad and specific things. You know, some things that we're going to do for students, and then there are some broader things that are just kind of systemic in nature. That are things that are just going to be good for our system in general too. You know, that kind of professional learning will benefit the entire system, not just only specific individual students. So there are things that are global in nature and then things that will benefit specific students. And both kinds of things can be found in this part and all parts of the plan.
All right, thanks guys. And then the last one before we talked about community circles and then take it open for questions here for a minute is data with Adam again.
The data category is another one, kind of like equity, that really sort of overlays a lot of the other groups. So as we worked on putting together a data plan, our focus is really on identifying or developing the necessary data collection instruments and tools that are needed to collect data, whether that's related to a needs assessment, especially, and that's going on right now as we work to plan for return to learn in the fall and identify what the needs are. And you've heard many of those needs discussed along with some of our mechanisms for gathering information related to them. But we're working on developing those collection instruments both for the needs assessment component as well as for implementation monitoring once we're actually into the fall, and really into August once we're implementing these plans. We're focused on, again, developing or identifying those collection instruments, also developing policies and responsibilities as it relates to who and how that data will be collected and maintained, and then also identifying reporting mechanisms and schedules. Our focus, excuse me, again, really overlies the other categories. So as you look at operational data, we're focused on data related to, for example, availability and use of PPE, technology access and barriers, as we've heard about, to the point that Lisa was just making, communications reach and barriers, staff and student health needs data, and then also student and staff absences. So some information related to program implementation at an operational level that might be specific to return to learn, and also ensuring that our practices are solid for those areas that really we already are monitoring, but perhaps have to use in a different way. On the academic side, same type of deal, where we're focused on data related to universal screening, pre-assessment, early warning system data, also formative assessment implementation data, data collection related to adaptive or modified instructional delivery, whether that's broadly or for individual students, also assistive technology need and the provision of those resources, grade and credit accrual, required continuous learning, coursework delivery, engagement and achievement, and then also teacher student and teacher family communications, like that log that was just being discussed.
So then the last thing for the kind of the first portion of our talk here with you guys tonight is around the community circles that the equity team conducted. We tried to solicit some feedback in a different way other than just the survey, although sharing those results with you, we had a high participation rate in that survey. We also felt like we had some good participation in the 4 different circle opportunities that were offered from a community format. Around 300 participants participated in those circles, and we tried to focus the different opportunities on one on special education, ELL, parents and students of color, and then one session that was more open to everyone. So we could kind of hear some of those specific themes or concerns from those different groups. And really the feedback we received could be narrowed down into kind of these 6 different areas you see. And you already heard I think some of our responses to that feedback incorporated into our planning. And so around communication, there was a lot of comments around clear, concise, multiple forms, the translation aspect, that we need to continue to develop and work on those multiple communication forms. We communicated a lot and a lot of information, and I think that's especially important for us to consider when we're communicating that to a variety of families. COVID and of course health concerns was a big topic. No surprise there. Flexibility and options for families seem to be an important point that rose to the top. And around some compliance to cleaning procedures, safety procedures. Really, that if we state we're going to do some of those things, staying committed to doing those. Plans for immunocompromised students and staff was another big theme from that conversation. Worried about lack of equipment and resources, anything from kind of a safety concern around PPE to technology to access with Wi-Fi, or being able to create some of our own opportunities for people to access Wi-Fi if we can't get Wi-Fi to everybody. A training component there as well for how to use the resources, I think was another one that came out quite a bit. And then also, like Lisa talked about, IEP 504 ELL, and making sure that those plans are individualized and I guess appropriate for the environment that we're in at the time. Learning materials and curriculum. We tried to get some feedback on obviously what we did in the spring, and I think people were looking for more, but also it's simplified in some way that it was easy for families to navigate, and that they knew what the expectations were, and that there was a kind of a schedule or a format that those things could be housed into. Focus on essentials, some performance monitoring. People want to know how their kids are doing. Obviously, they're concerned about some of the learning loss and kind of want to know if they're on pace and or if they're behind or if they're ahead in that sense. And so that was incorporated into the academic standards part. The social emotional relationships, as you can imagine, kind of all over the board here. Some people reported their kids felt less anxiety being away from school. Others said it was more stressful for them through the pandemic, and the lack of peer relationships and lack of positive adult relationships they had with folks at school was a stressor. Trying to look back at my notes here. Help and assistance to parents was another one. Trying to look for what activities and clubs could still go on no matter the environment we were in, to promote some positive social emotional components as well. And then just necessary preparation was really the last theme, and trying to make sure, again, people are communicated with, we're understanding of family situations, there's choice for families involved. heavy focus on people thinking some type of a hybrid model might be the best consideration. And so those were some of the relevant themes that we learned through those circles, and of course tried to incorporate those into our planning components. I think Lisa did a nice job of showing how we've sprinkled equity representatives onto all of those teams, and so that's a first consideration, not an after consideration, that it should be on the front end of that work. And so we wanted to get back to you on some of the data surrounding that and some of the themes we heard in that regard too. And so before we jump into this next part, you can see as models here, I'd say, what questions or points can we better clarify kind of where we're at? And this again was that 30,000 foot view we understand on some of these pieces, but we wanted to kind of set a framework for how we'll continue to dig into further details as we progress through the weeks of July here.
Okay, Matt, and I probably should have asked this at the beginning of whether or not we should ask the questions as we move through the different sections or wait till the end here. Well, it's not the end, but I think it might be helpful because I accumulated questions as we went. If we kind of scroll back up.
And just kind of go section by section, yeah. Sean? Yep.
I think we can start at the health and safety because the infrastructure is sort of built into all of it. So maybe folks can ask their questions on the health and safety, and then we can move on to the next one to make sure we don't miss anything. If that works for everyone. I just have, questions on the masks, the face coverings. That's a big one. A lot of input from our stakeholders on that. So for any rule, right, we have exceptions. So my question is, are we going to have some sort of list of exceptions, and how are people going to apply for the exception, or how are we going to kind of manage that, or do we have that? All of the questions I have, I understand if people answer is we don't know yet. So if that is the answer, I'm okay with that, but I want to ask the questions.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think some of the answers we know and some of them we don't. And so when we have a complete, process, I think that's when it'll be best to share some of that, Sean. I think what we wanted to reassure people is that we will be, asking people to wear face coverings as we go through. Of course, we need to consider all circumstances for that, like medical conditions, even age, or even times of the day when it's appropriate. Obviously, with students eating in a lunchroom, face coverings is going to be different there. And so as we look at that comprehensively, we know there will be exceptions to that. And like you said, and some of those things people are going to know how they navigate that process. And we certainly will come back with more information around that. I think what we saw after the information from the governor and the Department of Ed was that our community was definitely in favor of face coverings, and that we had a high rate of feedback on that. And I think even the work for the Health and Safety Committee obviously aligned with that aspect, that face coverings were an appropriate step for us to take. And so we also did want to try to show some flexibility there, that we know that's not that it may not work 100% of the time, but that our standard needs to be to work from. We will be using face coverings. So I don't know if I answered that really to your satisfaction, but I think, like I said, we'll have more, and there'll be more coming from that, but we're working from the standard of, we will have them.
Yeah, I understand that not all questions are going to be able to be fully answered today, but I'm going to ask my questions now so what I'm wondering about, because I assume other people will as well, and other board members can ask all of their questions, even if not all of the answers are going to be available tonight. You mentioned, eating. I think, we've already got a question in our Q&A about that, and that's a big thing, right, that we're going to have to figure out is how we're going to safely have kids eat. Mandating wearing a face coverings is fine in a classroom, but obviously you can't eat through a mask, so there's certain considerations to take there. So I'll open up to other board members if they have anything on the health and safety stuff they want to ask.
Sean, if you don't mind, we had a correspondence from the Dr. Oding in regards to the adequacy of our numbers of medical professionals that are going to be available in each building to implement this plan. So I would ask Matt, maybe at this point, are we going to have, where can we raise the staffing levels? Where can we raise issues about potential lack of staffing levels to carry out parts of this plan, specifically the health and safety issues?
Sure. So what you're going to see in July, we'll be bringing a little bit better financial aspect to you about where the CARES dollars have been committed and some additional costs we think will incur just because of the COVID pandemic that goes beyond the CARES dollars. And then I think the staffing one, we have to look at it globally. And I think you're making that point, Charlie, that it's not just nurses, but it's also, larger staff implications from that, some of that. And I think that goes into the model conversation that we're going to look at later. Obviously people understand the financial constraints of the district. We talked about adding teachers here early in the spring, and then even through this COVID pandemic and our inability to do that because of where our budget is at and through some of these additional costs. And so some things just don't work for us because of the cost, whether we like it or not. There's some real difficulties for us. And there's also some variables we don't have the answer to yet around transportation. If the guidance doesn't change around transportation, we could incur a lot more cost around transportation. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the only place we'd be looking at that, depending on some of the social distancing guidelines or some of the supervision aspects we need to account for during the day. And so I think that cost conversation we can have more in depth when we have that meeting in July. But I'm hearing what you're saying about the nursing FTE or some of the health professional FTE through that regard too. So, custodial staff would be another one with cleaning, right? I mean, there's going to be additional cost that goes on there in a lot of different aspects of the organization.
Right. Well, thanks for your response. And I would just reiterate that what I've tried to say in the past, that from my personal perspective as a board member, I'm looking at as safety and learning and not budget, unless budget is just an absolute, complete barrier to doing safety and learning things. So I hope the staff will work with us as we go forward.
Sure. Thanks, Charlie.
Matt and team, I do have a question, and let me know if I'm breaking up. I think my headset and connection is not working. But when will we get more details about some of these health and safety things, like classroom configuration and especially classroom cleaning and sanitizing procedures? I'm thinking mainly for especially those classrooms that see almost every kiddo that comes through, like PE, music, art, the lunchroom. What process will occur so that cleaning happens in between those transitions?
Right. I think that's a great question about when we can come back with some more detail around that. And I definitely think that's our intent. And so we tried to frame out what the chunks of information that will continue to come back to you with additional details will be. Ruthina, part of that does hinge on the models that we're talking from. And so I think that's the urgency on our end about trying to narrow down those models, because then it affects what strategies we employ from a cleaning aspect, from a staffing aspect, to all those things that then we can provide further clarification on exactly what that looks like. And so it's somewhat tied to that model conversation we're going to have the second half here. But like Kate talked through with the classroom configuration, there's some options there for removing things, but then, even who does the cleaning, how often does the cleaning happen? Where do all of those activities happen? I think some of those things are tied to the model. So I would say, every time we meet, we're going to have additional information surrounding each of these areas, and there'll be more and more detail provided as we continue to go throughout.
Matt, are we going to provide PPE for staff?
Yeah, we will be providing PPE for staff and students. We haven't determined exactly which ones or how much yet, but when we talk about the face coverings, we know that there will be some provided to staff and to students. The student portion, we're still wrestling with the conversation about, does that go to everybody? Does that go to those that ask for it because they don't or can't provide their own in that sense, or would rather take the one from the district? So we're still working through that conversation. Staff, obviously, as an employer, we feel like we have responsibility to provide them with the necessary equipment to do their job. On the student end, we're still working back and forth about if somebody wants to bring a face covering from their home, or do we start them with a certain number and then they would have to ask for more if they run out of those. So those are some of the pieces still in play, JP, but we do see ourselves providing that.
And for teachers and staff, are we thinking about a preference for face shields over cloth face masks? Just from that, frankly, having taught in a face shield and a mask, it's probably safe, but it's tough to get your point across when your mouth is covered. You know, it's pretty hard to express yourself. So I'll just
Kate, do you want to talk a little bit about what the health and safety team discussed with the face coverings?
Sure. The Health and Safety Committee recommended the shields for staff. However, I think we need to also leave that open for some staff may choose to use a face shield and a face mask as well. It's hard for us to recommend a face shield at all times when CDC recommends a mask. And sometimes you'll have staff that want to use both, if that helps.
That does, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Matt, you mentioned that we can expect to see some closing guidelines similar to our weather closing guidelines. When do you think that those will be ready to deploy out?
I think it kind of depends how soon we meet again and what maybe you guys have for an expectation on that. I think some of it we're close on for a component of that. Honestly, it also is tied to the model conversation about which we're transitioning between. And so if we know which models are still in play, if there's only 2, if there's 3, and we'll be able to talk through that in a better sense, Lisa, when you have that. But I think by the time we state what we would like to be doing for the fall, obviously we need to have that component out there too, so people would know how we would shift between and how we'd make those decisions. So I would say we're close on that. I mean, I think we're within a couple of weeks of having those ready to go for what those transition points look like, at least some basic framework. I would say that as guidance has continued to change with COVID through this whole situation, while we may publish those and we may say that is our best information at this time, we also probably need to protect ourselves a little bit with that information may continue to change too, as we know that we've continued to receive updates as we've went throughout about some different considerations we made had taken place. But I hope that answers your question. That I think we're a couple of weeks away from having that ready for you.
Hey Matt, this is Janet. And this may be part of the model conversation as well, but I've seen, classroom configuration. We talked about meals, things like that. What's the consideration for hallway movement of students, where students might be, gathering between classes and stuff like that? I mean, do we have guidance around that kind of thing for our schools?
Yeah, I would see that one continue to come, Janet, in the classroom configuration concept, or even how we consider building configuration and how we handle traffic flow for students and transition within the buildings. And so we talked about transition points between models, but we also need to talk about transitions in the buildings and how that's handled. And so that kind of goes into that classroom configuration standpoint. And so we'll definitely be having some recommendations on that, because that affects, like you said, everything from passing time to lunch schedules, components like that.
Okay, thank you.
And maybe you guys will talk about this later, but have we talked about screening and how that might happen? Screening questions.
Yes, we did talk a little bit about screening. Kate, anything you want to add there before I answer that one from the health and safety team about where you're currently into that? Or Chase, you've done a lot of work with that too, currently with their baseball and softball team. But
did, and currently we are doing on-site screening, JP, of everyone when they come to the building. I think the guidance that came from the DE last week makes some different suggestions related to that in terms of how we look at the feasibility and the resources we have available to do that if we were to bring all students back on campus. And so that's one of the ones that we continue to work through. We know that there's a lot more information in each one of those and that all these questions are pressing, but we were trying to kind of bundle the ones where we thought we were in a good spot right now. And I hate to sound like a broken record after Matt, but ones that, that were not necessarily as model dependent, or ones that we at least could give a broad framework. And so I think the best thing we can say on that one right now, so as not to alarm folks, one, direction or the other. It's something we're currently using as we bring people back to campus on a limited capacity through activities, and that we are continuing to look at, examine, talk to our local health officials, look at CDC guidance to ensure that we make the decision that we believe is best for the school district before we open up school. But it is high on the radar of something that's in our consideration and that we're looking at as part of the protocols. It's just not ready to be released for final guidance on yet.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge with that one is, in different settings, we can do different things in different ways, right? And so a smaller number of students that maybe participate in an activity, an in-person screener may be doable, but we don't want to trade one problem for another and create lines and groups of staff or groups of students and essentially do more harm in that by trying to do a screener. And so that's the part we're trying to wrestle with. And I think probably why some of the DE guidance rests where it does around the screener. Now, what that screener may look like, if it doesn't happen at school, does it happen at home? I think that's what Chase is alluding to there, right? Is about what is the best solution for us in that sense, considering all aspects. And so in some way, we know we need to account for that concept of a screener. It just may not be able to look the same in all experiences because of the size of some of the school configurations. Other health and safety questions, guys?
I would just add, Matt, to follow up on what you said, that this is not a comprehensive list of the things that the team is looking at. Kate and Dwayne have done a fantastic job, and so there are a number of things that we are considering, and that we're having conversations about. Janet mentioned movement in the hallways, and we've had conversations about signage. What does it look like? What about drinking fountains? Questions about use of lockers, cubbies. And so those are all things that are on the radar that this team is working through. And that's probably universal for everything that we're sharing tonight, that we know there's a lot more detail on that. And Ruthina, you asked a great question about the timing, and trust me, we've got plenty of folks on the ops team that are anxious for that information too, right? Because once we get a plan developed, then we got to start doing all these things, whether that's putting up plexiglass barriers, which we've already started doing in some of our auspices, or making other structural changes to our actual facilities. We know there is a lot of work that has to go in to make some of these things, to have them at the right spot when school opens on the 24th. And so everybody's working diligently to make great decisions, but to also do it in a very expedient manner so that we can start implementing those pieces far enough in advance of school starting later in August.
Sorry, Sean, I didn't mean to take over your spot there, but
I lost my spot
down
on my paper we're on academics. I made the screen bigger so I can see more faces, so I can see if it looks like people need to ask questions. So I can't see what's happening behind the scene there. So academic standards, I have a couple, they all kind of blend across from one section to another section. So I'm just gonna throw 3 of them out. I think they're all in the academic standards part. So one I'm gonna kind of loosely tied in. And so there's been some questions both here in our Q&A and other people have asked me with PE and music and how we're going to handle those, because there are requirements to do PE in our schools, right? It is an academic standard to do it. So how are we going to do that? With the accelerated learning, I'm wondering about how we're doing some of our, I'm going to use the word screener again, but in this case, FAST and things like that, how we're going to handle screeners, and, are we going to end up, and this is way too early to know this, but actually doing ISAFs, in the spring, or would they even think about doing it in the fall since we didn't do it this spring or anything like that? And then maybe a yes or no question is, with the synchronous and asynchronous ideas of online classes, would that be put into place whether we had a hybrid model or just all online learning, or is that also too early? So there's a whole lot I just threw out there. Go.
I missed the last question you had, Sean.
With the synchronous and asynchronous teaching the online classes, would that be available whether it's completely online learning or in the hybrid model as well?
Yeah, and I think we'll come back to that one some more in the model one. So if you're okay for that, let's save that point for when we kind of talk through the models, because I think that'll help explain some of that. But Diane or Scott, do you guys want to jump in with what you've had around conversations around music and PE at this point to take that first one?
Sure. I do know that that's been a topic of our conversations. We have specials teachers, music and PE art teachers on our committee. So we are waiting. We know that there will be some further guidance that's coming out from the Department of Ed, specifically on PE. I'm not quite sure about the other ones. And we know that we are looking at national guidance too, as far as music and band and how those might be able to be taught in a safe environment. So again, probably one of those answers that it's maybe a little too early, but definitely know that we are talking about those. Scott, anything to add?
Well, Sean, I would just say that the state hasn't waived the requirement for PE. They've been pretty explicit that we've got to figure a way to do that.
Scott, you've been talking with show choir, right?
I have, and that really has been about what summer activities might look like. So we're still not quite having that polished, but yeah, face coverings at summer practices for both vocal and choreography. No physical contact if you're gonna practice some choreography, that you can just do that as a single partner.
As far as your assessment question, the state also has said that we are not going to be waived the required assessments that we have to give. So we will be giving FAST, we will be getting ISASP. They haven't directed us yet as to kind of the format or how we might do that if we were in a online environment. But so again, hate to say it, but it's on our radar, but we don't have specifics with that one yet either.
Yeah, that was part of our submission today, that we would comply with the state assessment requirements. So yeah, whatever it looks like, we'll be expected to follow through on. Did we get all those there, Sean, on your academic ones? I think that was all your pieces.
Yep. So we'll throw it out there to other board members if they have some questions. All right, maybe you guys are just doing a great job. So
we'll take it. Social emotional behavior health was the next part.
All right, any board members have questions in this area? I appreciated the PD discussion around this area. I think that it's going to be pretty important for the mental health, I think, of our staff, just to kind of get an understanding for their own, social emotional health, and as well as how to deal with students in this time. I mean, this has been a very isolating time for everyone, and I think everybody's edgier than they ordinarily would be, and going back in the fall, it won't look like everybody is used to school looking like. So I think this will be a very important piece to kind of have everybody wrap their heads around and how we can all work through it. So I appreciate the PD part to that.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I appreciate this. I think this might be one of those opportunities that this crisis has brought on us, that we're really focusing on this, which we've needed to put more emphasis on for a long time globally in education. So both this and equity, I think, are going to provide us some opportunities to be reflective, and I'm excited to see that PD on there as well.
And I'd also like to add that it's really nice to see an emphasis on providing effective communication that will reach all families, both in this section and the equity sections as well.
This is Janet. I'm not sure if this fits in here or the equity section, but this question around social emotional learning, students have been, feeling isolated, right, from being displaced from school. How are we thinking about our disciplinary practices in light of kind of getting back into the classroom, and kids have not been there? And are we thinking about, discipline practices in light of kind of school reentry and what that might look like?
Well, discipline practices kind of fall probably in all of our areas, but one of the things that we want to place the biggest emphasis on is the prevention of any discipline. And so as part of the PD that we'll be rolling out, we are really going to emphasize 3 signature practices to support social emotional learning. And so in a very quick summary, that is in any learning environment to make sure that you have some welcoming routines and activities to create a predictable, safe, inclusive environment, that there are engaging strategies and facilitation strategies, and that there's an optimistic closure. So it's, hey, what are we going to do the next time we're back together? Here's what we reviewed, kind of a quick review of things. So those are just some effective practices to incorporate that actually increase students and staff's feeling of safety and security. And then kind of a 4th practice is teaching routines and procedures and making sure that that's taught. So there's actually, through that, our PBIS framework, our team had shared some resources with the staff last spring, just to say, so, you know, how you typically would go about teaching your routines and procedures. Here's some strategies that you also can use if it's a virtual format, and, you know, to share that with staff so that we can try to do as much preventative. And we also want to make sure, you know, that we're looking at that through a lens of making sure it's culturally relevant. And so I think our emphasis will be placed upon that, though you do bring up a really great question that, you know, we will need to provide some guidance to our administrators to work with their staffs to, you know, identify some of the areas where we do need to maybe identify if there are some behaviors that need to be retaught or, you know, appropriately corrected and followed through on. And, you know, we still want to have that valid and reliable data from student experiences to know if we're seeing an increase in an area where there may be, you know, some behaviors that aren't as desirable. Well, then you front load the teaching to try to prevent that in the future. So it's a really great question, but that is part of what we are thinking about in terms of how to package this professional development and have this series of ongoing PD support throughout the school year related to SEL, as well as discipline practices and how to appropriately respond, you know, in this virtual environment. You know, we hope there's not a spike in, for example, you know, cyberbullying or, you know, those sorts of interactions happening between peers. And so we definitely want to make staff aware of that, how to respond, how to report it, how to address it. So those are some thoughts that our team, you know, our SEBH team has discussed, but you're right. It's, you know, it kind of resides everywhere.
Yeah, it's a great response, Laura. Thank you that's very comprehensive and thoughtful. I sort of where I was going was I would not want to see, you know, a spike in disciplinary practices because of the, you know, change of the students' experiences coming back into the classroom in the fall. And what you're talking about is being preventive and do PD and responsive, culturally responsive approaches. That all makes a ton of sense to me, and kind of an understanding that kids are coming from different backgrounds, different experiences coming back into the classroom, and you know, not defaulting to discipline and looking at other practices to help students get back into the groove of being with their peers and being in the classroom and that kind of thing. So really, really happy to hear that approach that the district is taking. Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate that support. You know, we all have to remember we have to teach first. We're here to teach. And so we have to make sure we're setting up that environment with teaching and providing those supports. So I appreciate the question and those comments from everybody.
The one quick thing I would highlight for everyone, good evening everyone, by the way, is that we've been real intentional with setting aside time for that work and for those opportunities to talk to kids about social emotional competency. And you see mention of it, but I'm not sure that, you know, you can totally glean from what we have in the slides, and whether it's the continuous learning schedules that we have set up in draft form for the elementary or secondary, or in our elementary curriculum time allotments, you will see things like morning meetings on there, or these Zoom meetings in the springtime, where some of our staff has definitely had experience in the past with morning meetings. we haven't ever had it formally as part of our schedule. So all of that work is underway too, to make sure that we have intentional time carved out for all of that.
Before we move on to the next section, Matt, can I ask you and your team, you know, a few questions have come in through the Q&A and some with the chat, and some are being answered via the chat or in real time. We're actually answering the questions. So I would ask, you know, anyone of the team, if you see a question that you can definitively answer, feel free to jump in and answer it, kind of read it out and give the answer. But if there are things that we, like many of our questions are going to have more clarity later on, appreciate you guys taking kind of the notes down to make sure that we're addressing it at some point in time. So I don't know how this thing all records and whether the Q&A and chat is hard to find later. So in the moment, I would appreciate if you guys are at least kind of making note of some of the questions. And if you can't answer it, feel free. Otherwise, I think we can move on to the next section. Are we on to the equity section, I think?
Yeah, I think the thing we can do, Sean, is make sure we recorded those questions down. And if we don't get them all answered tonight, then we can come back with some responses and make sure those are accounted for in the next conversation. So heard what you said there. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, man, I think we can only come back with them, but we can probably start or, you know, reconfigure a FAQ that we put together back in March when we first had COVID, and we can, you know, update that on the webpage and kind of rephrase it as a return to learn FAQ and house those there as well.
Exactly. All right, so the equity one, where there are questions here, you heard Lisa talk about the universal design for equity and how we've tried to incorporate that into our thinking throughout, and that's a big part of the equity consideration here, that it's not an afterthought or retrofitted after the fact, that it's intentionally on the front end of the planning of those different areas. So questions or comments on equity?
Matt, I noticed that under parents, the very first bullet point is that there's going to be parent choice in how some students return in the fall. Do we know what some looks like? Or do we need to figure out kind of
I don't know if it's my internet or yours stopped, Lisa, but I lost your comment there.
Yep, I've lost Lisa too, so I think it's hers.
I think I understood where she was going a little bit about, do we know how many? Yes and no. I mean, you know, when we did a survey here a couple weeks ago, we've also heard in the community feedback this week, their answers potentially would have been different when more variables are known, or when maybe variables are known in a way they didn't like some of that guidance that came from the state. And so what we'll need to do is, we do know we need to get a better accurate of that picture of what that would look like when people are presented with that choice. And so we'll have to continue to refine that data and answer that question. But you'll see as we go through the model conversation here in a minute, how we're kind of ballparking the approach to that right now. And of course that could fluctuate, but we know we'll have to continue to get more of that. And I think we can't ask people, you know, what their choice is until they have a very clear picture of what they're making a choice to do. So that's a necessary step. We want to make sure they have as much information as they can before they're expected to make some kind of a choice, or that we're presenting a choice to them in that sense. So I don't know if you jumped off there, Lisa, but.
I did, not voluntarily. I'm sorry about the
That's
Wi-Fi.
okay. Did you get my answer, or do you want me to kind of walk through that again?
I caught the back end, which I think is we got to see what the models are going to look like better before we can flush out the parent option.
Yeah, because we had a little bit of information on the data from the survey that we had done, but even some parents that you guys saw communicate with us throughout the week said, well, if I had known that's what it was going to be, my answer would be different, right? Well, some of the information we shared tonight may change their mind. And so I think our responsibility to our community is to make sure that they are making an informed choice, and that they know what those different models would look like, and what they're opting into or what they're choosing to do. And so the more we can give them on that, that will be the appropriate time to ask them, so that they can make an informed choice. We'll ballpark some numbers when we go through the models here, based on maybe some of the early data we saw, or even what we've seen in trends of other parts of the country with some different modeling aspects, but we'll have to continue to narrow that down.
I've got oh, go ahead, Charlie.
Okay, so Matt, this is Charlie. Just want to commend you and the staff for developing a really great universal design for equity approach here. I think the description developing the contact log was right on in saying it's very difficult to do. And I think we all realize it's a very necessary tool to have so we can see how we're doing in terms of engaging all students in the district and their families. Reviewing all the existing IEPs, it's a daunting challenge, I'm sure, and I hope we have enough staff and enough resources to do that well.
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yes, all students with IEPs have an IEP teacher, a case coordinator. And so that case coordinator will be responsible for reviewing the IEP and making a plan for remote instruction. Yes.
Yeah, I guess that was kind of my question, Lisa. Sorry, I keep cutting people off every time.
Yes, I'm gonna punch you in your head. Oh, sorry, my mic is on. Sorry.
Wow. You're supposed to like text that to me or something, not say it out loud. Could I just, Lisa, I have a kind of a big question, and I understand there's so much variety in IEPs across the board. I'm trying to wrap my head around how we implement with fidelity IEPs when we have remote learning. I don't expect you to tell me how you're going to implement every single one, but can you just kind of talk to the process to make sure that we are able to do that for our students?
Yes. So every IEP will include a remote learning plan, which could look different than the plan that we implement when a student is right in front of us at school, because the same things aren't always possible or appropriate in a remote plan. And so in fact, it will be a programmed part of the IEP now. It'll be a page on the IEP. The programmers are working on it right now. It was never a programmed part of the IEP before. So literally there is a recognition that it may look different. So there's a process that our staff will lead the team through to talk about what should the considerations be, for a student when we're trying to provide remote instruction. What are the things the team needs to talk about then? And what are the things that are important? Actually, we've learned a lot through the remote instruction that we've already done, especially like at our high school required level. Our teachers who have already taught remotely at that level have learned a lot and have had some really amazing insights gained from that. Also from our virtual ESY that we've been doing over the summer here. We've had a lot of teachers who actually have learned a lot of really good things through that. We've come up with a lot of really, really good insights. But it's difficult work, but I think we have a lot more to go from than we did clear back at the beginning of that required model when we were trying to plan then. So yeah, the plan often will look different because it is different. The platform has changed. So it should be a discussion, with the team that is different.
So Lisa, going back to some of the things with the IEP discussion, can you remind us, was that done during this first closure? And when you're talking about the team discussion, I'm assuming that includes the parents to ensure that everybody's on board with the return to learn plan for their specific child and their plan. And just, I know that it's going to depend on the models that we have, but I'm assuming there's going to be sort of this dual action of what it looks like in school as well as if we have to close. I know we might not have all that information right now, but could you share what you do have so far on what that would look like?
Okay, so there were several different questions in that. So I'm going to start with the very first order of business. IEP teams always ideally would include the parent. I say ideally because sometimes parents refuse to be included. They don't want to be included. We really, really try to include them. We always want them to be included at whatever level they will allow us to include them. Sometimes people are busy. They feel like they can't spare the time to be included. If they feel like they can only be included on the phone, wonderful, we'll take it. If they feel like they will only provide written input, we'll take it. We'll take whatever they will give us. So having said that, we always want them there if possible. So yes, we always want to include them. So that's a yes for sure, absolutely. So a remote learning plan meeting will include the parent. The second order of business is there will be an IEP meeting to discuss a remote learning plan, whether or not we are going to have remote learning. So we make a plan in case we have to go to that, virtual type of learning format, even if we haven't made a decision to do that yet. So that's in case anytime during the year we would have to do that, or at any point. We also will have a plan for if a hybrid model has to be enacted. So we plan for all of the scenarios. So yes, we already have an on-site plan. We know if everything is as usual, we have the IEP already. So we're not talking about changing the IEP until it's time to, have the IEP meeting. We could change the IEP if the IEP team feels that's appropriate, or if something has changed and it needs to be changed. But the purpose of the meeting is to discuss a remote learning plan or a plan under a hybrid model. That is the purpose of the meeting that I'm talking about now. So does that make sense? There could have been another question in there, but I forgot what it was. Is there something that you asked that I forgot to address already?
I don't believe so. So yeah, if some more comes up, I can just pop back in.
I think you said, can I discuss of what it will look like? What it looks like is what it needs to look like for the student. We are trying to create a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different options for to meet the needs of a lot of different kinds of students that, special education is, we meet the needs of individuals. We provide faith. That's the bottom line. We meet the needs of the students to provide a free, appropriate public education for students, and that hasn't changed.
All right, we ready to move on? All right, what are we on? The data portion. I don't know, I guess it's probably more infrastructure than data, but I know we were moving, we looked at stuff last board meeting or 2 board meetings ago, working on the one-to-one at the elementary level. I guess where are we at with that? How far down the road have we gone?
Sure, we have ordered devices for the extension of the 1-1 program to all students. So those devices have been ordered. They are not yet arrived in the district. I believe our delivery date right now is July 13th. So we expect to get them in about 2 weeks, almost exactly 2 weeks. And we're currently working on plans for how those devices will be distributed. We have to ensure it's not just elementary. We'll have new students at the secondary level, whether that's new 7th graders who are not part of the secondary one-to-one program last year, or students who are brand new to the district. And we have a great process for in-person device distribution that we've used in previous years that's been very efficient. If that is possible in a modified way that accommodate, provides for the social distancing required, certainly we already have a plan in place for that. If we are in a remote situation, we're also developing a plan for distribution of devices in sort of a satellite pickup model, and then also available to distribute to neighborhood sites as well. So we have a couple of different plans for how we'll distribute. And, as we get to the model conversation, we may get to the point where we're doing a little bit of both, but those are on the way. All of the cases are on the way. All of the licenses are ordered. So we do anticipate that we'll have all of those devices in district ready to go by the start of August.
Anything else from anybody? All right. Is there any questions on the circles and the meetings that we had? I think everybody's kind of interested in getting into the meat of it, Matt.
I bet.
So
it's like the big reveal, right? No.
Yep.
Thanks, Sean. So the second half of the conversation we wanted to have with you guys this evening, as you heard us reference several times, is around the models that are still in play for us to use. And really, you've heard us talk from these 3 frameworks, from on-site learning, which think about before COVID pandemic, but obviously with some changes because we're still in the middle of the pandemic, required continuous learning, that at-home learning component, where the students are primarily getting the bulk of their learning in an at-home environment, and then a hybrid learning model, which would be a combination of both of those. And so in some sense, we're going to ask you to kind of think creatively around what this hybrid conversation could look like for us, because if we're being honest with you, most likely we'll be in a hybrid format at some point all year when we look at these first couple models. And then also need to have a conversation around if there's momentum or interest in pursuing the AB option that we'll share here with you. Before we go into some of the detail of these, I'd say there's some models that we're not even going to bring you this evening because they've been cycled out from either low community interest when we did survey them and didn't feel it was responsible to continue to talk about those, especially with the high participation rate in the survey. There were some other models that when we looked at the feasibility of being able to pull those off, just were not doable. And so they really didn't make it to the conversation in that way. And so I'm sure you've read about other ideas or you've read about other considerations, but we felt like these are the ones that make the most sense for the school community and for us to continue to talk about, to provide some of the pieces that we talked to you about earlier and that we've talked to you about through this. And so I want to talk to you about these first 2 models kind of in concert. And so when you think about that on-site and then also the off-site or the at-home learning piece, if we are on-site, this is where the element of choice comes in, that we need to be transparent about what health and safety considerations we are able to do. It's not going to be risk-free. It's probably not going to meet the expectations of every single community member about the health and safety components we're able to build in. It's going to be more risky to send students to school, to send staff into schools than it would be to stay home. That is a given in this situation, and I think we need to be honest about that, but we also need to talk about what we can legitimately do from a health and safety end to try to mitigate that risk. Some people may not feel comfortable with that, staff or students, and then we'll have to work through that component. For students and families that don't feel like that's an option, we need to be able to provide a required continuous learning at-home option for them to still take advantage of. And so when we say 90-10 to Lisa's question earlier, that could be the percentage we start with, based on what we saw percentage wise, there was only really about 10% of the people in the survey that said they would want to pursue that option for their students at this point after the spring. I do think being able to better articulate what our at-home learning model looks like and how it would be more robust and different than what was in the spring may be more appealing to people, and it may not. I mean, they may be still obviously hungry to get their kids back in classrooms, and obviously that's where we'd want them to be as well, in accounting for safety as much as possible. But that would be majority of kids on site, and that we would still offer this at-home learning option for students that did not feel that their families did not feel that was the best option for them. The other flip side of that is if we're in such a situation that we don't feel like we can bring the majority of our staff and students onto campus because of community spread of COVID and the current health and safety concerns, then we would be again in this offsite required continuous learning. The difference in this hybrid model would be that opposed to how we handled this from March to the end of the school year, there would still be some students that we would try to bring onto campus and some staff that we would bring onto campus to deliver some services. We know that learning loss is a significant concern. It's a significant current concern for our structurally disadvantaged students, for all of our students to that end. But what services could we continue to provide around SDI? You heard Lisa talk about FAPE and making sure that we could deliver on a remote learning plan for students. Would there be some in-person instruction that would need to be a part of that, even if we had most of our students offsite? Language services for ELL students in that case. And so again, think about this one kind of as the other side of the continuum where everybody's at home, but there would be some students we would work to still serve in person on a limited basis. Maybe not daily, but like it says, a modified schedule where we would try to do some of those in-person services. So either of those two, I think, are ones that legitimately we have to consider, that even if everybody's on site or the majority of our people are on site, there has to be an at-home learning option for those that don't feel comfortable. And even if we're off-site because we've hit one of those metrics or those transition points where we've determined it's primarily unsafe for the majority of people to be there, would there still be some students, we would try to offer that, and we could do some increased, obviously, social distancing and health and safety measures if we were only dealing with 25% or less of our population coming onto campus, and that end, even if the community spread was bad there. There's obviously further conversation that we need to have about that and what people would feel comfortable with doing. But I think legitimately those are two options we have to consider. The other two are ones that I think we need to have some feedback on from you this evening about if they're ones we should continue to consider or not. The first is a straight AB model. And this would be, just like it sounds, half the students are in school one day, the other half of the students in school the other day, following a traditional schedule. Obviously, this helps create a situation where we can have a better chance at social distancing. The challenge here is going to be our responsibility to our staff. Teachers and staff would still be on site every day. And so we would vary the instruction in a way that there'd be one day of on-site learning and the second day would be asynchronous learning for the students while they stay at home, but teachers and staff would still be expected to be on campus every day. This obviously creates a challenge for teachers and staff potentially about childcare concerns in that end, that if they're expected to be there every day and their kids are only going to school every other day, if they don't have an older sibling or childcare that can problem solve that situation, it puts our staff in a difficult position in that regard. The other model, considering an AB rotation, would be to bring our PK through 4 kids onto campus every day and do on-site instruction daily, but rotate grades 5-12 through an AB rotation. So, you know, some reasoning here would be our youngest students being able to have access to in-person instruction every day, while being able to try to provide some increased social distancing for grades 5-12. We know our secondary campuses are extremely large, that would help give an opportunity to continue to space some students out in that aspect. There would, you know, you'd relieve the childcare conversation for our youngest students because they would be on campus in a consistent basis. I think I had another point I was going to share on that one. I lost it here for a minute, but It's really the difference between AB for everybody or AB for those 512 and PK4 would be on site every day. I guess the other thing I was going to bring up, obviously you could hear some concerns from staff around the staff equity issue here, that if, you know, PK4 is serving a full caseload of students or a full classroom of students on a daily basis, and your 512 staff is serving half their students on an every other day rotation. There are some research considerations around obviously youngsters and what's happening with the spread of COVID or the rate of infection around our youngest students, that if this is something we want to pursue, we could obviously come back with some additional information and, you know, research to support reasoning for wanting to do that. But I think the first place we wanted to start were either of these models that you wanted us to continue to consider, or are they too problematic for us to continue to look at, and we really need to work from the framework of those first two. So with that, I would ask Amy or Chase to help me with any descriptions there, as they've been closest as we've talked through the hybrid conversation. There's been some other people on the team that have also worked through some of those components too. So if anybody has anything to add there to the descriptions, I think that'd be good now, and then we can obviously take questions. I think actually before I do that, I know one thing I forgot. Another thing I wanted to say that we did consider is looking at the RAM and what happened if we just went ahead and balanced the RAM, which goes against really a district philosophy on doing weighted resource allocation model. But what if we reallocated our staff across to try to alleviate class size because of this health and safety concern around COVID? And really we can only get our classroom class size down to 27. And I don't think it was worth presenting that as I guess a legitimate option. Of course, if you guys feel differently, we can revisit that conversation, but for maybe what it would undo for the gain we would get about only being able to reduce class size to 27 across the district if we tried to equate class sizes, we didn't feel like that was another one for us to explore too much further in depth. So Amy or Chase, anything I forgot there as we've talked through these the last few days?
I think you did a good job of giving an overview on all four of those, Matt. The thing I would say is, of course, there's pros and cons in each of these models, and you know, depending on where we go and kind of what the questions are, we can go more in depth as you know, broach those questions for us. You know, nothing is ideal except for not having the pandemic and bringing kids back on site, and so as we just kind of sift through this. It's going to be important that we can anchor towards or start walking towards what we think is feasible, because there's a lot of work that's contingent upon, you know, making a decision fairly soon.
Agree with that. The only thing I would reiterate is just, you know, and it's on here, so is that choice option, that no matter what model we go with of any that have been described, we do want to provide parents that level of choice to ensure they're making the decision that's best for their family in terms of health and safety throughout these. And so while we are looking at a model, even if it's not written in the description, that's why we did caveat at the bottom that piece continues to be there for families to select if that's what they so choose.
Yeah, thanks for that, guys. I do agree with Amy that, you know, some of the planning, as you even heard us talk through some of those other scenarios, is, you know, some of the teams are waiting, right, to problem solve those. And obviously we wanted to bring this to you soon enough that if there was things we wanted to take out, or if we wanted to continue to pursue, that we had enough space to do that. But I would say that's the conversation we're in now about exactly what are we problem solving for. We've kind of done the high level, the piece we could do for the at-home learning component, some of the on-site component, and then really now it's about which model we're going to plan and prepare for as we get there. And so we need to know what's still on the table or kind of what's off the table from perspective. And we understand you're seeing these kind of for the first time here, but after we got that community feedback that we shared with you, we felt like this was the most reasonable ones to bring to the table to have a discussion around. So where can we better clarify, or what questions do you have, or things that you're thinking about?
So Matt, this is Janet. I'd love to hear actually from Brady and kind of get the voice of the teacher. And is there a point of view, perspective, pros, cons from a teaching staff perspective on these different models? Can we get Brady to weigh in on that?
I haven't really had a chance to talk to our, leadership team or teachers broadly to be able to answer that very effectively. I'd say, I'm sort of I haven't seen them much in advance, to be honest, either. There's been some conversations in committees that I'm on, so I had a sense of maybe where we were, and I'm not suggesting that's a lack of partnership or collaboration or anything, but I can't probably answer that very accurately tonight. And probably the, generic answer that there's pros and cons of both is true, but I would want to run that just through more folks before I weighed in publicly. I appreciate the opportunity though, Janet, I do. This is probably, a pretty tricky one.
Yeah, no, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Brady. I think this is all happening, people are moving real time and getting information out as we have it. For me, that would be an important factor is sort of where teachers are landing in terms of their view of the different models, because obviously they're heavily impacted in this as well as families and students.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I completely appreciate that and respect that. And I'll follow up with teams tomorrow. We were sort of waiting to see also a little bit if there were things to continue to explore or not, or even have a conversation with teachers about after tonight. But then, yeah, definitely, I'll have a better sense, after tonight and use our process that we have moving forward. And then I'll be able to bring that back as well.
And that's been on our radar as well. Janet, Brady, and I've been working. We have a meeting set up on Thursday morning to help get some feedback from teachers, and really specifically about not only the models but health and safety, because that is an important voice. But it's just the timing doesn't always allow things to happen all at the same time. But we agree it's important, so we want to get that voice at the table. And also understand that it's hard for Brady to carry all that water all the time. And so we want to make sure that we don't put that burden on him either.
That's what I was just going to say. I think it's going to be a difficult one, and I don't mean to speak for you, Brady, but to navigate, right? Because I think in the different scenarios, it means different things for different elements of the staff. And so I think the opinions are going to be different about it. If you look at a PK4 teacher in that last model compared to a teacher that teaches 512, that's going to be a different experience potentially for them. Or if they have young children versus if they don't have young children in some of these models, that's going to be a different consideration. And so it's going to necessarily you might be able to develop what the overall majority or consensus is, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not extremely difficult for some of our staff or for some of our teachers. So I get where that's going to be challenging for you, Brady.
No, it is. I appreciate that too. I will say, especially after last Thursday's pitiful guidance, 2-page document from the state, and even their attempts to clarify on Friday and then again today, that health and safety of students and staff is absolutely dominating people's thoughts right now. And so whatever model it is, and I know that's sort of we're in a waiting period. There has to be really robust, intentional, well thought out health and safety considerations. And, we feel lucky in our district to have the partnership that we do, to be able to work with you as a board and with the administrative teams. And I know that's not the case across the state in some of the meetings that I've been involved with at the state level. But that's really going to be, that's a massive consideration. People love teaching and they really want to get back to a normal situation, but they also have, really profound levels of anxiety and concern that run deep and in different ways based on their own circumstances. So that'll be something probably everyone's waiting. I think probably everyone on the Zoom and the attendees, we probably all would like to know what it is that we're going to do, which is almost an impossible thing at this point, so that you can just start to plan out and figure out what your own personal, situation is. But absolutely, I mean, the health and safety, that dominated probably all of our Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, schedules and calendars. So.
Oh, Matt, this is Charlie. I read the APA document that Dr. Wallace sent to us today. And I'm wondering how do these 4 models comport with the APA recommendations in the staff's view anyway, or maybe you're still evaluating that question?
Yeah, I would say, I don't know if I have a complete answer to that question, Charlie, in every scenario about the guidance with that. I think the best thing I could say around that is maybe where we started with some of those health and safety considerations and just letting people know that even some of the best recommendations, or things we would like to do, if I'm being honest, I'm not sure we're going to be able to do all of those things. And, some of these models give us a better chance to be able to do some increased health and safety measures, but it's not always going to be possible when we have large buildings or even in our smaller buildings and in small classrooms in some of that sense and with the amount of students we put in there. I do think, I made the comment about younger students, and the learning loss component of there, and is that a bigger risk, for the students than the COVID piece? I think you hear pediatricians talk back and forth around that too. That can be a long-term detriment, to be away from school for that period of time and some of that component. So it's hard to know because everybody also has personal opinions around it. And I know you're asking specifically about that report and where these mesh, but I don't know if I could give you as complete an answer as you'd like to know where these models stack up with that. But I think these are our best chance at about trying to consider recommendations we've seen from health and safety across the board to give ourselves a successful start in whichever frame we're in.
Okay, so are these four options? Do you think the health and safety group is comfortable with stating that they're compatible with the sets of guidelines that we have we're committed to following?
Well, I think what the health and safety group would be charged with doing, Charlie, is to say if we said we were going to plan for the first two and then one of these A/B options, or if we're only going to plan for the first two, then what health and safety will do is put their lens on it and come back with recommendations about what we can do in that scenario based on what they've learned over the time they've met with their committee and from the research they've gleaned. They would say, if these are the models under the health and safety aspects that we can try to employ to help mitigate risk. Will mitigate all risk or be able to reduce that. But where we can social distance, where we can use face cover, where we can not rotate kids when we don't need to. I mean, all of those things will be helpful. But again, they're all contingent upon, which model and what we're able to do because of the model we're in. And that's what they're charged with doing, right? They're charged with looking at all those different models and then developing health and safety parameters around each of those.
I think, go ahead, JP.
Well, I mean, I was just going to cut to the chase a little bit and say I'm one of these hybrid models. Certainly, I don't see 90% of our kids coming back to school safely. And I think 25% of our kids coming back to school just isn't enough. I like this PK4 5-12 split. I think that because childcare is a major concern for many, many families, and those are the kids that are going to need the most childcare, and so that helps that. Now, if we did rotate 5th and 6th graders, would we do like 5th grade one day, 6th grade the next day to, you know what I'm saying? One day 5th grade goes.
We'd probably still try to do it by alpha, JP, because if the potential they would have a sibling in grade 7, 12, that it would match up on a similar schedule for families. Okay. So even though 5th and 6th grade, some families may feel comfortable leaving them home if they did have an older sibling, we would at least try to put families on the same rotation. And so that's why we suggest the alpha, rotation.
And then, if we did something like that, what would it look like, say, for a 6th grade teacher who has half of her kids in class and half of them at home? How would that work with the synchronous? I mean, would we essentially be kind of zooming in the classroom just live? I'm just wondering if you thought about how that might look from the teaching standpoint.
Right. No, it would be more asynchronous, right? So it's kind of, even though we move from everybody in a 50-50 model to just 5-12 on a 50-50 model on the AB rotation there, that second line or the third sentence, I guess, in the AB description there, teachers will conduct 1 day of on-site learning and students will engage in asynchronous learning an alternate day. That's our assumption about how this would work, that students would be in front of their teacher for 1 day, and then the other day would be an at-home learning component with asynchronous opportunity. So it wouldn't be synced live to the classroom in that sense. So secondary, maybe you're able to frame it a little bit around almost what happens in a post-secondary setting where you have on-site delivery for 2 or 3 days, but there's still some learning components you're expected to do the days you're not in front of your instructor at that point. So that's the way we would really see it, not necessarily zooming into the classroom on those days, but more of an asynchronous learning day.
Building off your question, JP, I would just point out too, so you've got PK4 on site every day, AB or 512 in that rotation, and still that opportunity like Chase spoke to earlier about some parents requesting that at-home model, continuous learning model. So it's almost like you have 3 things available or working at this in concert.
So I'll jump in. I too find the pre-K4 and then the AB for 5 to 12 interesting. I think that there's just so much research about the importance of pre-K to 3rd grade and making sure that we don't lose learning with that group of students. And that's when the inequities really start to develop. That kind of putting our energy into that group makes sense from an equity standpoint. I do wonder if we could explore a hybrid of the hybrid, or a hybrid squared, where instead of the asynchronous learning taking place on the opposite AB day, if we could think about a synchronous learning program, and that way teachers who are at high risk, who don't feel comfortable being back in the classroom, maybe we could have a teaching core that is 100% online. And those teachers are teaching online, while teachers that are low to medium risk or have a comfort level of being in the classroom, they would be doing the in-person instruction. Because there's just there is a lot going on, but I wonder if we could consider that, if we have the person power to make that happen.
I think that goes on a little bit of what Amy was talking about there, about building off JP's answer of what we try to envision for some of the staff members that may have health conditions that prevent them from being able to be on campus. And then are they able to deliver some of that remote learning for the students that decide to do the stay at home option? I think where you're tying it in then, Lisa, is to the students that would even be on an every other day. Would there potentially be any opportunities there? And so I think we could continue to discuss what that may or may not look like, and how those programs would potentially sync together. I think like we come back to is, if that's something we want to further pursue, of course, then we can bring back more information, and we know our teams will get to work on it. We just need to know what to shut down and what to continue to explore at this point. And so I'd agree with you on the PK3 piece and about the learning loss, and that's where I was going with. There's a substantial risk in that too, with being away from school, and the health risk is real and it's significant, and it's our front of mind concern, but that is also not one to sleep on.
And Matt, to the first part of Matt's, or to JP's question, transportation is going to be easier if we do it by the alphabet and grade as well. If we split it up by 5th and 6th grade, as opposed to half on and half on, both age groups, the families will be split up in transportation. It becomes more difficult. So transportation is a huge part of that.
I would just also selfishly point out, though, if there could be a waiver for the alphabet, because not all kids share the same last name within the same family. So if there could make sure that there is an exception or waiver or application protocol.
Yeah, we had that on the slide, and then it got too wordy and we ended up taking it off. But that's a great point, Lisa. We definitely want to account for that we make sure we keep families in the same cohort of students. So we'll definitely do that.
I was going to say, similar to something what Lisa mentioned about the dedicated teachers in the classroom and online, and that, not even necessarily or adding to the fact teachers who can and can't teach in there. There are also teachers who did a good job or feel more comfortable teaching online versus teachers who don't necessarily have that same passion or desire or skill set to do the online side of things. And another question, I don't think you answered this already, but if in any of these models, if you have students at home that are doing online learning and in the classroom, if you don't go that way, would you be requiring teachers to also do all of the online and in class teaching? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure I tracked it there, Paul. I think it does make sense, but I lost you in Adam, did you hear it? Did you want to respond to that based on what we just talked about? Or who was the other person trying to?
It was me, but Paul.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I couldn't hear it either, really.
Paul, are you asking, this is Brady, just to clarify. So are you saying, I think the conversation at the district level, maybe this will answer it, has been that there would be potentially some teachers who might be a district online teacher who had students from second grade all across the district from families who were unable to or unwilling to or have their student with us on site. And so then that would be that person's assignment. And then the second grade teacher at elementary X wouldn't, even if one of the students was in their attendance area, that wouldn't be their responsibility. They would be with that dedicated district level online teacher. I'm not sure if that was what sort of the question. So you would try to be juggling if I'm the on-site teacher, plus I have students that are online for the full year, trying to do both of those things at the same time. That wouldn't be sort of the vision ideally, I think.
Right, yeah, and I think that answers it.
Yeah. That's the conversation we've been currently engaged in. I think that would be difficult for the teacher to have a roster of students at home and then a roster of students in front of them. And so ideally we'd like to have that separated, and I think it gives a better chance of success for that model in that sense. So I think Brady captured it there.
And just to follow up on that, let's say you have students in the classroom and now you have a student that needs to maybe self-quarantine for a while, and that student would go to that online class, and it'd be tough to have that. I would assume it would be tough for that to kind of jive for students, learning from two different teachers and then maybe coming back to the classroom. That's just one hurdle that maybe I would see on that model.
Yeah, and I think we would, we'll continue to work on that, because if it's a quarantine, it's like an extended sickness, but they would still be a part of that class. And then what would we do for, continual learning while they're there? When do they really need a shift to online learning? Would there be resources that the teacher developed for them to continue to pursue like we would on this previously? And so I think that's some of what we'll continue to work through with the teachers groups about what makes sense. And it also goes a little bit to some of our transition point conversation we had early in the health and safety slides about if a whole classroom, would need to be away from school for a period of time, if the whole building does, if the whole district does, what does that look like? And then you're kind of drilling it all the way down to the student level, right? And I think that's a good consideration for us to think about as well, and one that we have.
All right, I'm going to try and jump in here. I got a lot of thoughts, and I'm going to kind of go contrary to what a lot of folks have been saying. I think we do the best service for our kids if they're in class. I think when you had your 90-10 model, right, it was the 10% was this estimated number of how many folks wouldn't feel comfortable or able to be there. And I think how we answer all of the other questions that are popping up in the chat and everywhere else, like how do we handle distancing? How do we handle recess? How do we handle this, that, and the other thing, is going to affect what that 10% number actually ends up being. In any sort of A/B model, it gives us the physical distance, or makes it easier to do physical distancing. I should say that. It doesn't completely give it to us, but that's kind of the only thing it gives us, and it opens up a whole lot of other issues, in my opinion. Whether it's childcare or learning loss because they're not in a classroom every day, or whatever it is, it will create other issues if they're not there every day for the sake of just getting physical distance. So I think if there's any way to try and better handle physical distancing to get more people in the classroom, it's better. And if we do that and we put it out there that we're going to have just on-site learning, and we put out what all of our various ideas are on how we're going to clean and distance and the wearing of the masks and all that, and it comes back with 50% of the people say, well, we're not doing it. That's their choice, and I think we might have to revisit it. If we mandate that we're going to do it every other day, we're taking the choice out of everyone's hands on what they feel comfortable doing and what's best for their families. So I don't want to say that I'm dismissing the physical distancing, because that is one of the primary, recommendations, right, from the CDC and all medical professionals, that we need to do that. But in a A/B model, that's the one thing you get, and it hurts in a lot of other places. So that's my take on it. I would do everything we can to push getting the kids in the schools, because I think it will be much better for them and their education. And I know we are responsible for their education and their health and safety. So I don't know how we put one over the other, but that's exactly what we're trying to do here, is put one over the other. I think no matter what we do, there is risk involved, and we are going to try to do everything to mitigate risk. I do think some plans have a bigger chance of having a negative impact on their education.
I think you bring up some excellent points, Sean. And I think that the one thing about the 90-10 is that's where, when we saw some other places, the number may have started lower, but then as people trended, they sent more students to school, and that number shifted upwards as time went on. The thing I would want to be transparent with folks about is what they'll see from us on a health and safety end is, if we do kind of plan for the most students we anticipate we'd see there, we won't be able to do the distancing that I think people expect. I mean, we don't have room in our buildings. We don't have the staff to be able to do the social distancing that people might expect. And so that's the part where, again, I think we're all saying the same thing. We just have to be transparent about what it is and what it looks like, and then people can make that choice. My general sense is I don't think it would meet the expectations, that some of our stakeholders are going to have around what social distancing might look like. If we have that option and we have a high percentage of our kids attend, it's not doable to space kids out into our facilities in that fashion. You're right. And then so it's kind of a priority thing, right? I mean, is that enough of a priority that we need to look at, almost having our student population through a rotation of days, or is that not enough of a priority that we feel like there are enough other health and safety mitigation efforts that outweigh not bringing our kids in on a daily basis? I'm not sure I said that the right way, but I think you get the effect of where I'm going with this, that, is the every other day so we can do distancing a bigger thought, or is having the kids on campus so they can continue their learning in an on-site environment the priority? And some of it is, even if this is a model we pursue, pulling the trigger on it when we have the best information we have is what's going to be important too, because we know that the community numbers have continued to rise over the last couple of weeks, and that's a real piece, and it could look different in 2 weeks. It could look worse, it could look better, depending on those numbers. And of course, that's going to affect people's comfort level in those different scenarios too.
This is Charlie. Sean, thank you for broaching that possibility. I'm not quite sure how the equity or our ability to do off-site learning in an equitable way would play out in at least the last two options, AV and PK4 on-site. As I understand it, there are so far our experience with engagement from students of color has been not terribly encouraging. If I'm wrong about my interpretation, please let me know. So I guess right now I'm more interested in the 90-10 option than I am in these last two.
Thanks, Charlie.
You know, I do appreciate that and getting more kids in. I also know that every place we've seen social distancing go away has had major outbreaks. And that's what I'm worried about is if we can't educate anybody because we've got a bunch of people sick, including staff. So that's why I just think finding a balance and for me, I'm being a little, I'm leaning towards the health and safety for now because of what we're seeing going on, and we live in a hotspot. Yeah. And if we get a lot of people sick, then we're not educating folks either.
Yeah. This is Janet. I'm resonating to both 90-10, but also the concern around health and safety and the current spikes that we're seeing. And I'm unclear whether our communities have it in us to try to flatten the curve and, you know, social distance and do all the things we need to do to try to stem the rise of the positive cases. One question I have, I feel like I'm asking more questions tonight than commenting, but, you know, have we, Matt, or others kind of taken a poll of what other businesses are doing in the corridor, for example, in terms of their return to work plans? I mean, for me, that's another kind of benchmark that we can look at. I mean, I can tell you, we watch what other organizations are doing, and there are some large ones saying they're not opening back up from work from home until January, and that's in the corridor, because they're saying, don't know, we want to be part of the good trend of, you know, flattening the curve. We're not going to expose our employees to having to come back in and health risks and that kind of thing. I mean, I think this is a community kind of discussion, not just school districts by ourselves. We've got to see what other organizations are doing and other members of our community in terms of their plans for reopening and how they're planning to do it. And so I just didn't know we had any of that kind of data too, to see what others in the corridor or other districts around us are doing in terms of returning to work or returning to school. If we don't, as a community, work together to stop the increase of infections, then this could just keep going on and on. I mean, I know I'm stating the obvious, but I guess I'm kind of leaning on the health and safety side. If I had to lean a direction tonight, swayed heavily by current factors, but also that the long-term need to stop this so that we can eventually really, really get back to the 90-10 or even 100% model, right? There's so many unknowns, and if we continue to gamble with opening when we're not ready, or we're opening and we can't put the proper safety measures in place, we gamble with continuing the infection rate and preventing us longer term from getting back to business as usual.
Sure. No, I think that makes a lot of sense, Janet, but as far as how you talk about that as a community conversation. And I think you do see a lot of businesses having their employees stay home. I think that would be my anecdotal feedback from it. I don't have any statistics or percentages to support that, but I would say from the conversations we've had as far as their community calls, that you do see a lot of places asking their employees to stay home. I do think, you know, it's important to look at from the community end. I think the flip side of that is, you know, the unique role that school does play, and still, even if parents are working from home, you know, the challenge of being able to do that and then do at-home learning. I think we've heard that feedback for people is difficult. And, one of the functions is that a childcare component. And so that people are able to do their jobs. And so I don't, and nobody's saying dismiss that, but we know that's not a piece we can dismiss either. That, I think there is some pressure that people want their students to be able to go to school in some fashion and want them to be there. I would say you talked through that was what other districts are doing, from what we know about other districts. And I would say a lot of the superintendents I've heard from in the AEA that a lot of their districts are planning to bring kids back on campus. I mean, that is the general trend, that they're coming back. And
in a 9-10 sort of model, or this?
Yeah, and I'm not even sure they're building in the choice. I mean, I don't know the details of that plan. I do know Cedar Rapids is, we've talked a little bit through that we feel in the corridor, at least that kind of choice component is fairly similar. They haven't probably had as much conversation around the AB model that we've had internally, but they did talk about the choice, kind of those first two that I talked through about if they were off-site, bringing some kids on campus if they need to, or if they were on-site, being able to give some families some choice for that. But primarily, I would say a lot of the AEA soups are, they're bringing their kids back and trying to put in some health and safety things and doing the best they can. But it's down to what I said before too, that social distancing won't happen in those circumstances, in those different arenas.
Lots of pros and cons.
Yep.
So I'm wondering if the health and safety group would give an opinion on the PK4 and the 90-10 models in terms of this. What's the effect of what's the effect in a school setting of not being able to achieve the social distancing that's achievable in other areas, especially if we're doing face shields, mask, and fighting transmission from with that route and cleaning.
Yeah, and Charlie, maybe I'm taking your question the wrong way, but I think one thing we don't necessarily want to jump to at this point about which one are we talking about to start school. That's not necessarily the conversation we're ready to have at this point. I think right now we're wanting to have the conversation around, are all four of these still in play? I think the 90-10 and I think the 25-75 or whatever that percentage is has to be in play for us for the whole year. If everybody's on site, we still know we need to have a choice for people that can't come on site. If we're at home, we may still need to entertain bringing some kids onto campus to serve them. I think those two are constants for us and something we have to consider. I think the thing we need to know is if you want us to continue to talk about a 50-50 model, the straight AB, or this PK4 on-site daily and 5-12 on an AB rotation. If you do, then we can bring some health and safety components around those models specifically, around what that would look like, if that makes sense. And then I think when we have that information, then we can make a decision as we get to mid-July around what school will look like for the fall and which one we would plan to start with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Everything you said makes sense, right?
Okay.
It makes sense, and it's hard for me to say take anything off the table, Matt. This is Janet again, because I don't know what our infection rate's going to be on the 24th, and if we're in an upward trend where we are now, I'm going to be leaning more towards an AB model or a PK4 on-site daily 5-12, just because of social distancing and needing to provide the proper space and to ensure, the prioritizing health and safety. If we're on an upward trajectory. If we're on a downward trajectory and we're seeing really good signs in our community that our community members are embracing social distancing, staying home, doing the right thing to prevent infection rates going up, then I'd be more open to a 90-10 or 75-25. It's hard for me to say right now because I don't know where we're going to be August 24th.
Exactly. Really exactly.
And I feel like we have to keep these options open. Sadly, I know it's a lot of work for y'all and all of us to kind of figure out how we're going to make this work. But until we know what's happening, from a community standpoint, I just don't know that we can. From my perspective, it's hard for me to take any of these off the table.
And I don't think we necessarily think that's a bad thing at all. I think we just want to make sure we're problem solving for something that could legitimately be used. I think the one that's maybe not generating a lot of conversation from you guys is the AB from PK 12, all the way through. And if I'm hearing that, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that one, I do think Brady's, and again, not to speak for him, but I do think that's going to be a difficult challenge from us from an employer standpoint about how we treat our folks, that if they're expected to report to work every day and they have children that, they don't have childcare for in that experience. And so I do think that one would be somewhat difficult for us to wrap our heads around. But if you want us to leave that one on, we definitely can. But I'm hearing more, I guess, conversation around the last one about PK4 on-site daily and 5-12 on an AB rotation. But
yeah, I'm trying to imagine what the different daycares would do every other. I mean, that logistically to have a kindergartner in and out every other day. I I don't really see that one as being workable. And another point, I think it's going to be easier to scale up to 90% than start at that and have to go to something else.
I'm going to jump in here and just weigh in. I really don't see how the 50-50 AB model could work, even from a health and safety perspective, because we're talking about straight from pre-K all the way up to 12, and we know that daycare will be utilized because not everybody can stay home with their kids to provide that in-home daycare. And so we're going to have more kids either being watched by other families or in and out of places where they're just being exposed to even more germs. And then we bring them back in front of our staff and teachers and expose them. I don't see how that can work for our community, especially our communities that they have to go to work, or they rely on older siblings helping out more so at home. It will, for me, I see that causing a lot of angst and a lot of more harm than good related to learning and health and safety. I would personally like to explore the pre-K on-site daily in 5 to 12 and the 90-10 split. Because I think that takes into consideration the health and safety and learning ramifications that we've been discussing tonight.
So the way we could continue to talk about this would be a suggestion here. Maybe I'll confuse you, but would really be that our on-site model, remember when we talked about those 3 models the state gave us, would be on-site, at home, or required continuous learning, and then hybrid. So our on-site model, we know, would still have an element of choice for families to stay home. Our off-site model would still reserve an element of choice for us to bring some students onto campus if we need it. And then our hybrid model, what I'm hearing, is really looking at this PK for on-site daily or a potential 512 AB rotation. The truth of the matter is, when we talk about those, they're all really kind of a hybrid option, right? And so, but we can kind of think about it in those 2 realms. That if it's easier for you to think about, those are really kind of the 3 we're talking from, or if we're really talking about we're in a hybrid the whole year, no matter which of those 3 we're in, whatever helps kind of frame your thinking around it. That's some of the language we'll probably continue to use around it, because even if we're in an on-site delivery model where the majority of our kids are there, we still think we're going to have that element of choice, right? Students are going to have to come on campus, and that this is really kind of maybe what people really think about when they think of a hybrid, is something more similar to what we're talking about with this AB rotation for 512 students and some kids on campus every day. So I don't know if the team has other comments or if the board has other comments, but I think if we know those are the things you want us to continue to work from, we can definitely do that. We can continue to flesh out and explore those models and problem solve those. I am wondering if we think we want to continue to have some weekly conversations here from a meeting structure standpoint. I know we had weekly meetings as the COVID thing started, but I guess I would kind of ask the board leadership and the rest of the board if that is something you would like to do. We could continue to come back on a weekly basis around some of these things for a period of time. And we talked about release of information. I think we still will intend to release some of that information on a weekly basis. And if that's good to have an in-person conversation, we might want to consider that. But I think knowing that if we're going to work from some of this framework, then that may make some sense to do here for a period of time again. But I'll just kind of leave that open, I guess, for consideration or conversation for you guys tonight too.
Hey, Matt, I just have 2 quick questions, and then I'll say that I'm okay with having the weekly meetings, because I think people want to know what's happening and around the district. I mean, I get asked every day what we're going to do. So I'm okay with having the weekly meetings. We did it before. My 2 quick questions I had was, one, if we, even if we did the PK for on-site daily with the AB rotation, could you also, for students, special education students that needed it, could they also be, even if they weren't PK for, on-site daily if needed? Would that be a possibility? And then the second thing is if you, in the 90-10 model, we go back to full however classes like we've had before. Was there ever discussion at the secondary level to do block scheduling?
Block scheduling was talked a little bit about. There's some different reasons. There's pros and cons to anything. As I think you've heard us say around some different things. Block one that, but there's and I don't mean to just pick on this one consideration, but I mean it would affect things like our collective bargaining agreement and about teachers and how they're assigned to teach periods and some of those things that are probably some just hard logistical conversations. Not that somebody would necessarily be opposed to those. But just from some of our traditional structures that maybe it prevented some of those conversations from moving further. I think your special ed conversation, I know the answer, is whatever the student needs is what we'll give them. And so if there was something they would need from a daily experience in that sense, then, maybe that is going to be the best way to deliver it, is that there would have to be a component of it where they receive it on site every day. Maybe the component is, they would be okay in the AB option, but that would really be up to that IEP team to work through and then decide what makes sense. But I think you would have flexibility in the system if that's what ultimately the team decided to be able to do something like that, Paul.
And Paul, this is Brady. We did in academic standards actually mock up some block schedule possibilities. It was less contract issue actually, and more sort of some of the impacts potentially on electives. That's what seemed to be one of the
that's another great one. Yeah, too, Brady. Yeah, I mean about where they fit in and how you're able to offer those. And
I think teachers are willing to look outside of the normal boxes for sure. That's been a real consistent theme, given what we're facing. But that probably was the barrier. Not that it's insurmountable, but that was sort of the thing that we ran into. We had some really great teachers working on that as a possibility.
Kind of like our trimester semester conversation. I mean, these are the issues when Brady and us work on these things about what are all those unintended consequences of trying to solve one problem, and then what are the other consequences that are created because of it. And oftentimes we do run in some elective difficulties there about either length of course or amount of offerings we can continue to provide if we do a schedule shift. So
I'll jump in. I'm meeting weekly. That's fine. I think that we kind of took some time off and now we're ramping up again, and it would probably be a good idea. Like Paul, I get asked daily about what's going on. One of my concerns, sweetie, one of my concerns with the 9-10 model, I mean, ideally, yes, we would be on the 9-10 or the 100% model, but what's important to me is delivering consistency in the plan. And my fear with going to a 90-10 model is that it's sustainable only for so long. And then we experience a surge, and then we have to move to online learning. And then we get over the surge, and then we go back. And we have a lot of jarring back and forth. I think that type of inconsistency isn't good for the kids. It's going to be extremely difficult for the parents. I think that our Iowa City parents and other areas are great, and we are resilient, but it'll be easier for us to put together a child care plan for the entire year rather than having to worry about the plan changing every 3 weeks or every 6 weeks or every 8 weeks and scrambling to find different levels of care because we're moving in and out of these models. And so if we have a greater success, a greater chance of staying in one of these hybrid models longer and more consistently, that would be, I think, a huge upside that we should weigh against the benefits of having more kids in the school longer. And then I'd also ask what data or metrics are we using? And this is just my personal opinion, but I think that this state opened up way before it was safe to do so. And we're seeing the ramifications of that now with the new spike. My employer is still relying on that CDC phased guidance to determine when we're going to come back to work. And we're 100% telework right now because we haven't even gated into phase 1, looking at our community transmission rates and our rates of positives, those data-driven numbers that the CDC put out. we do a data call every week and send it to DC on Friday, and we have not been approved yet because of how unsafe the situation is in Iowa from a health standpoint. Are we going to look at numbers like that? Because I feel the pressure from the community to get the kids back in school and open up, but I think that that's pressure that's not based on science or health and safety numbers. That's just us seeing the impact it has on our kids and wanting them back in their environment. Are we going to use some science in making this decision?
So yes, Lisa, I mean, that's where when we talked about those transition points, I think that would be the important, and why we call them transition points is because we didn't necessarily want to call them closure points. But at the same time, I think it's like you said about how are we using that information to make decisions, and then also making sure that we're not making multiple transitions all the time. And I appreciate your perspective on, is there one we'd start in that we could potentially stay in longer until we could ramp up instead of starting in a place that we also might have to quickly because things don't go well. So I do think that's an important consideration for us when we do get to the conversation about which one do we want to start with on August 24th, and what's the data informed decision we're making surrounding that, and why is that? And so we want to be prepared to share those data sources and data points with you when we get to that conversation about asking for which one we want to be under. The other piece is the governor has, talked about, the presumed method of instruction is in-person delivery, and you only being able to use one of the other models if we're under that emergency declaration. And so some of this does hinge on being under that emergency declaration, which we're under for another 30 days. It was extended. But if that runs out and August 24th is sitting here, then some of that is going to be forced for us too. So we'll have to continue to monitor that from the state level and know what our options are at that point as well.
I'd like to comment on some of the stuff Lisa said and tie it back to Janet's comment too about it, kind of looking at our community and seeing what's going on. And I think we're all aware of, what the cases have done in Johnson County here over the last 7 to 10 days, right? They've climbed quite a bit. I work at a place where some of my company is able to stay at home and work remotely, but there's been, our lab folks are essential employees, so they're in there. And so we're trying to do sort of this hybrid thing too, right? Where some people are in one area and people are in another area, and we have this whole phased approach to get people back to work. Some of that guidance is, wear face masks and face coverings if you are not able to be socially distant. It's not do them both. And I don't know where that guidance is coming from. Our corporate overlords that come and tell us to do these things. So they do kind of split out those two things as separate things. The one thing that I would point out as to one of our biggest problems that as the governor has opened up our state, they've allowed, businesses are allowed to tell their employees to wear face coverings, but it hasn't been mandated that all the people going in there do, right? And that's the change that we're making here. And I get it. It doesn't eliminate all the risk. I am concerned, as Lisa said, yanking people from one plan to another plan is very detrimental. It's very akin to, moving from one school to another school every year, right? These are that, that just random jumping around is hurtful for kids. I do think that we run that risk no matter which plan we start in. It takes one case to kind of blow up in the school, and then what do we do with that school versus all the other ones, as you talked about earlier, Matt. So there is no plan that is going to be the perfect fix here. And so I think it's important to kind of go back to your original question, Matt, is I think it's important to keep our options open at this point and look at, more than just one plan at this point. I think, the next 2 months could go great, or it could go very badly for our area. And it may make the decision for us at some point. But all the people asking the questions via email and our chats and everything, they're just going to want to know, what is the plan? When are we going to know what the plan is, right? And and we don't have that date yet. And so I do think it's very critical that we really flesh out, you know, a couple different models that if these, you know, data points exist, then we're going down this route because we're kind of forced into it. And if this data point exists, we're going down this route. And we need to have those fairly clear for people. I understand that we're not making that decision today because we don't have all those data points, but I think they need to be very clear for people to be comfortable knowing that whichever way we land on, it's because it is data driven and we're going to do the best thing for all of our students and staff in that regard. So that's my 2 cents.
So I think what I'm hearing you guys say is, you know, leave those options open. And I do think, you know, part of people's questions to us in the conversation we're going to have, even if we haven't made a decision on which of these we're going to do, if they know how we're going to do each of these, some of that will continue to inform their thinking, inform the help to answer some questions around that. And then to your point, Sean, about when we have the data, to say this is the model we're going to start the school year with, and this is why, that substantiates the reason, right, for why we're moving that direction. So those are all things we can work to develop and prepare for. I don't know if there's any other questions I have or that you guys have before we would try to close the conversation. I think one thing I just don't want to miss the opportunity to say is to thank Brady and his team for the work that they were doing. He said at one point, you know, teachers haven't been unwilling to think outside the box, and that couldn't be more true. They've really stepped to the plate and volunteered a lot of time and energy onto these teams during the summer, brought creative ideas, creative solutions. We've thrown it at the wall and see what would stick, and some things have, and some things haven't made it, but it hasn't been for lack of effort or lack of trying. And then the same thing on the administrative team, great leadership to lead these conversations and bring collaboration. And there's a lot of rabbit holes to get lost down, but people have done a good job of trying to bring it back to the top. So what I'm hearing is we would leave PK4 on-site daily in a 5-12 AB rotation model under consideration. Obviously the 90-10 and the 25-75. I think it was just a way to frame your thinking around what could potentially happen there. I know there's been some comments around, is 5-12, you know, the right way to look at it? Why is it not PK6 on site every day? Part of just the thinking on that was, you know, 5th and 6th graders, maybe parents would feel comfortable with them staying at home by themselves if they needed to in that scenario. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe you guys will hear feedback that's not, but it would be 2 more grade levels. We could have a chance of doing some distancing if only half the kids were there on a basis. So that's why the decision about 5th and 6th grade was included in that AB rotation, along with the secondary students. So other questions or things we can help provide clarity on? Otherwise, I think, like I said, what I'm hearing is that we'll continue to talk about those 3 options.
Just as we move forward, if we go to these weekly meetings, can you work on at times updating us just when you have more information? Because we have been asked on the larger things like band or orchestra classes, or how music or athletics may move forward. I know those are questions that we're getting now. Is there going to be volleyball? Is there going to be football? How would that look? You know, like we have baseball, softball now. It's a little bit different, but we have it. You know, how are those things going to look moving forward as we get closer to the school year? Because some of those things start before the school year happens. So I'd just be curious if you could update us on that stuff as you guys kind of move along with that too.
Yeah, we certainly will. And yeah, no, we don't necessarily need to wait for a meeting on that all the time. If there's some of those components we can share with you via email, we're happy to do that in advance of the whole community conversation around those things. Those are, you know, we had a council meeting again today, and activities considerations is part of that after our administrator meeting for some of the same reasons you were just talking about, Paul, that some of these things start up soon. And, you know, some of the guidance says we could start July 1st. Probably saw our note go around about July 6th and some of the things we'd be entertaining and some of the guidance we'll put out. So as those things come up and as we have decisions on those, we'll try to do our best to filter the ones that we think are important for you guys to know. And then we'll, of course, continue to talk on Tuesdays in more specifics.
Any last minute thoughts from anyone? The one thought I would just throw out there is, we're getting, later and later in the summer, and school's going to start before we know it, right? It'll be a blink of the eye. And we have certain deadlines throughout the year for different things. Somebody asked the question about a deadline for saying they were going to homeschool, right? There's different deadlines for all sorts of different things we have throughout the year. Are we going to be fairly lenient in some of those things, or all of those things, or none of those things? Just throw that out there to think about.
Some of our traditional deadlines is what you're saying, Sean, about how we would handle those. Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to communication too, right? I mean, about especially being sensitive around our communication efforts around any deadlines we have, and how we handle those. So we'll note that as a definite consideration too, about how we treat those deadlines and how we've communicated that ahead of time, especially if we're in a variety of scenarios and a lot of information coming at people.
And then I agree with, most of the board members that said they're okay with the weekly meeting. I would say we do have a P&G meeting scheduled next Tuesday. So we would either push this after, maybe keep a P&G short or something, but, Ruthina and I and Matt maybe can figure that out. Yeah. But I think it warrants it. And, if it gets to the point where we don't have any updates from the last week, we wouldn't need to have one necessarily, but my feeling is there will be something to update at least a little bit every week, because it is changing so fast. So again, I'll throw it out there if there's any last minute thoughts from anyone, because I'm getting hungry. Sweet. If not, I would entertain a motion to adjourn from someone.
So moved.
Second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right. Thanks to everyone for all the time and the good discussion tonight. And
see you all
sounds
tomorrow.
like maybe we'll see you in a week or tomorrow.
Nope, tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Good call.
4:30.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye everyone.
Aye.